I want to be upfront about something most people don't know about me. I don't scare easy. I grew up in these mountains. McDowell County, West Virginia, the deep end of it, where the hollers narrow out and the ridge lines close in above you like the walls of a church. I've been in the woods at night more times than I can count. I've heard bobcats scream at 3 in the morning, sounding so much like a woman being murdered that it'll stop your heart mid-beat. I've come across black bears on trails where there wasn't enough room for both of us. I once found a man's boot on the side of a logging road, no foot in it, no explanation, and I just kept driving. That's the kind of place I come from. That's the kind of thing you learn to fold up and put away. But what happened to me at my grandfather's cabin in February of 2019, that's something I've never been able to fold up. It doesn't fit in a drawer. It doesn't shrink with time. If anything, it gets heavier the further I move from it, like the memory itself has weight, and it's leaning on me from behind, waiting for me to turn around and look at it again. My grandfather passed in the fall of 2018, lung cancer. He was 81 and had smoked since he was 12, so nobody was surprised, least of all him. He left the cabin to me in his will, a small 2-room place about 9 miles off the county road, up a gravel track that turned to mud every spring and ice every winter. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a hand pump out back, and a propane lantern he'd used since the 70s. The place was old but solid, built by his father sometime in the late 1940s, back when people still lived that far up because they didn't have a reason not to. I hadn't been up there since I was a teenager, but after the funeral, I started thinking about the cabin more and more. I was going through a rough stretch, divorced, working too much, sleeping too little. I thought a weekend alone up there might help me reset. Just me and the quiet. No phone signal, no neighbors, nothing but the trees and the wood stove and whatever I brought with me. I drove up on a Friday afternoon in mid-February. Valentine's Day fell on a Thursday that year, and I remember thinking it was fitting, spending the most romantic day of the year alone in a dead man's cabin on the side of a mountain. The road was worse than I remembered. The last mile was mostly frozen ruts and dead leaves, and by the time I got the truck parked and the cabin door open, the sun was already dropping behind the ridge. The place smelled the way old cabins do: damp wood, cold ash, something faintly sweet beneath it all, like the ghost of every meal ever cooked on that stove. I got the fire going, swept out the worst of the dust, and set up my sleeping bag on the cot in the back room. I'd brought canned soup, coffee, a bottle of bourbon, and 2 paperbacks. That was my entire plan. The first night was exactly what I needed. I sat by the stove reading until my eyes got heavy, then crawled into the sleeping bag and listened to the fire tick and pop as it burned down. The silence up there is different from silence anywhere else. It's not empty, it's full of the small sounds that fill in when the big ones go away. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind pressing against the walls, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the leaves outside. I fell asleep before 10 o'clock and didn't wake until morning. Saturday was cold and clear. I spent the day walking the property, checking the tree line, sitting on the porch with my coffee, watching the fog burn off the valley below. I found some old tools in the shed and tightened a couple of loose boards on the porch railing. It felt good to work with my hands again. By the time the sun went down, I was tired in a clean, honest way I hadn't felt in months. I made my dinner, read another few chapters, and settled in for the night. The fire was low but steady. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it moving through the bare trees outside, that dry scratching sound that branches make when there's nothing left on them. I turned down the lantern and closed my eyes. I don't know exactly what time it was when the knocking started. My watch said a few minutes past 2 when I finally looked at it, but the knocking had already been going for what felt like a while before I was fully awake. It came in sets of 3, slow, deliberate, evenly spaced, not frantic, not urgent, patient, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world and knew I was inside. I sat up on the cot and stared at the front door. The fire had burned to embers, and the only light came from the faint orange glow leaking from the stove's vent. The cabin was nearly pitch dark. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, same pace, same weight, each one landing like a closed fist on old wood, firm enough to rattle the latch. I didn't answer. I didn't call out. Something in me, something old, something I think I inherited from every person who ever lived in these mountains, told me not to make a sound. I just sat there in the dark, watching the door, barely breathing. The knocking stopped. For maybe 30 seconds, there was nothing, just silence and the faint hiss of the dying fire. Then I heard it at the window beside my cot, no more than 2 feet from where I was sitting. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same deliberate patience, but on glass this time, which made the sound sharper, more intimate, like someone tapping on the inside of a fishbowl, trying to get the attention of whatever's swimming around in there. I turned and looked. The window was a small, single pane, old and cloudy, and all I could see through it was the snow and the dark shapes of the trees beyond. No figure, no face, just the empty winter night looking back at me. The knocking didn't come again. I sat there until dawn. I didn't sleep. I didn't move from the cot except once to put another log on the fire because the cold was becoming unbearable. Every small sound, every creak, every gust of wind sent a jolt through me, but nothing else happened. No more knocking, no voices, nothing. When the first gray light came through the windows, I pulled on my boots and coat and went outside. The air was bitter, maybe 15 degrees, and the snow from the previous week had crusted over with a thin layer of ice that crunched under my feet. I walked around to the side of the cabin where the window was, expecting to find nothing, expecting to tell myself I dreamed it. I found footprints, bare footprints, human, no shoes, no boots, just the clear impression of 2 bare feet pressed into the frozen snow, toes splayed, heels deep. They circled the cabin. Not once or twice I counted as I followed them, my breath coming out in white clouds, my hands shaking and not from the cold. They circled the cabin 11 times, 11 complete loops. The prints overlapped in places where the path repeated, creating a trampled ring around the entire structure like some kind of ritual I couldn't begin to understand. I followed the trail where it finally broke away from the cabin and headed toward the tree line. The prints moved in a straight line across the clearing, spaced evenly, unhurried. I walked alongside them for maybe 40 yards, keeping my distance the way you might walk beside the tracks of an animal you don't want to catch up to. That's when I stopped. I stood there in the snow staring down at the prints, and the realization came over me slowly, the way cold water rises around your ankles before you understand you're standing in a flood. The direction was wrong. I'd been assuming the way anyone would that the prints led away from the cabin and into the woods, that whoever had been out there had come, circled, and left. But the prints weren't leading away. The toes were pointed toward the cabin. Every single track, every loop, every circle, whatever made them had come from the woods, walked to the cabin, and then circled it, not the other way around. The trail I was following didn't end at the tree line. It started there, and the loops weren't aimless. Each circuit was slightly tighter than the last. The first loop was maybe 20 feet from the walls. The second was 18, the third, 15. By the 11th, the prints were right against the foundation, close enough to touch the siding, like something tightening a noose. I followed the final set of prints, the tightest loop around the back of the cabin, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The trail ended at the crawlspace vent, a small rectangular opening near the base of the foundation, covered by a metal grate that was supposed to be screwed into the frame. The grate was lying on the ground. It hadn't fallen off. The screws were still in it, pulled clean from the wood, from the outside. I looked at the dark opening and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child, a fear so total and so absolute that it shut down every rational thought in my head. I didn't crouch down to look inside. I didn't call out. I didn't do any of the things a reasonable person might do. I turned around, walked straight to my truck, and started throwing my things in the bed. I didn't pack. I didn't fold anything. I didn't even go back inside for my books. I just tossed what I could reach through the front door and left. The drive down the mountain took 20 minutes but felt like an hour. I kept checking the rearview mirror, and I don't know what I expected to see. I kept the windows up and the heat on full, and by the time I hit the paved road I was shaking so badly I had to pull over and sit with my hands on the steering wheel until my breathing slowed down. I didn't go back. Not that weekend, not the next. I called a real estate agent in March and listed the property for well below what it was worth. I didn't care. I wanted it gone. The agent asked if there was anything she should know about the cabin, any issues, any history. I told her no. I told her it just wasn't for me anymore. It sold in April to a couple from Roanoke, a young pair looking for a weekend project, something rustic they could fix up together. I signed the papers, took the money, and told myself I was done thinking about it. Then the phone call came. It was a Sunday evening in late March of the following year, almost exactly 13 months after that night. The woman, the new owner, called me from a number I didn't recognize. She was polite, but clearly unsettled. She said they'd been doing some work on the cabin, reinforcing the floor, and when they pulled up a section of the old boards, they noticed something. The underside of the floor joists, the thick beams that held the whole cabin up, were covered in scratches. Deep ones. Dozens and dozens of them, scored into the wood in long, ragged lines, like something had been clawing at the underside of the floor from below. Some of the scratches, she said, were in clusters, groups of 5, spaced like fingers. She asked me if I knew anything about it, if there'd been an animal problem, if maybe a raccoon or a possum had gotten into the crawl space at some point. I told her I didn't know. I told her it was probably nothing. And then I hung up and I sat in my kitchen and stared at the wall until the room got dark around me. I've thought about it every day since. Not the knocking that I can almost explain away, almost file under wind or branches or some drunk wandering through the mountains in the cold. It's the footprints that won't leave me, the tightening circles, the crawlspace vent pulled open from the outside, the scratches under the floor. Because the thing I can't stop calculating, the thing that wakes me up at 3 in the morning and keeps me staring at the ceiling, is the timeline. Whatever was out there circled that cabin 11 times, barefoot in the snow. Then it pulled the grate off the crawl space and went under the cabin. And then the knocking started, which means it wasn't knocking on the door from the porch. It wasn't tapping on the window from outside. It was already beneath me. It was knocking from below. And when I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, telling myself not to make a sound, it was right there, inches beneath the floorboards, close enough to hear my heartbeat, close enough to reach up through the cracks if the wood had been just a little thinner, a little older, a little weaker. I think about those scratches on the joists. I think about those clusters of 5. I think about what kind of hands leave marks like that in solid wood. And I think about the 11 circles, each one tighter, each one closer, like whatever it was had to work up to it, like it was building its nerve. I don't go to the mountains in February anymore. I don't go to cabins. I don't sleep on the ground floor of any building if I can help it. And some nights, when the house is quiet and the wind picks up outside, I swear I can hear it. 3 slow knocks, coming from somewhere below. Toward her, my boots crunching on the gravel, my breath hanging in front of me in pale clouds that the fog absorbed immediately. I stopped about 5 feet behind her and said it again. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need me to call someone?" That's when I noticed her feet. They were bare, as I'd seen from the truck, but up close they looked wrong. The skin was dark, not dirty, not shadowed. Dark in the way that skin gets when the blood beneath it has stopped moving. A deep blue-black, mottled and waxy, planted flat in a shallow puddle of ice water that had pooled in a depression on the shoulder. She'd been standing there long enough for the rain to collect around her feet, long enough for the water to partially freeze at the edges of the puddle, forming a thin crust of ice that her ankles broke through. I don't know how long a person would have to stand barefoot in freezing rain for their feet to look like that. Hours at least, maybe longer. The thought made my stomach clench. "Ma'am," I said, more firmly this time. I reached out and touched her shoulder. She was cold. Not cold like a person who's been outside too long. Cold like the ground. Cold like the rain itself. Like there was no warmth left in her to lose. She turned slowly. Not startled, not reactive. Just a smooth, mechanical rotation of her upper body, as if my touch had activated something. Her face was pale and drawn tight against the bone, her lips slightly parted, tinted a shade of gray that I'd never seen on a living person. Her eyes were open, wide open, but they weren't looking at me. They were looking through me, fixed on some middle distance behind my head, focused on something I couldn't see and wouldn't want to. She spoke, one sentence, clear and calm, with no tremor, no urgency, no emotion of any kind. Her voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "He told me to wait here." That was it. 5 words. She said them, and then she went quiet, and her eyes drifted back toward the tree line, and she turned away from me as slowly as she'd turned toward me, and she was facing the woods again as if I'd never been there at all. I stood there in the rain, my hand still half raised from where I'd touched her shoulder, and I felt something I can only describe as a deep, cellular wrongness. Like every part of my body was telling me to leave. Not to help, not to call out again, not to try to bring her to the truck, just to leave. to get back in the cab and drive and not look in the mirror. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't leave a barefoot woman standing in freezing rain on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. Whatever was wrong with her hypothermia, a mental break, drugs, I didn't know she was going to die if someone didn't get her out of the cold. I didn't have cell signal. I hadn't had signal since I turned onto Route 9. The nearest place with a phone was the gas station at the Brenton Junction, about 4 miles east. I told her I was going to get help. She didn't respond. I said it again, louder, nothing. She just stood there, facing the trees, the rain running off her like she was made of stone. I drove to the gas station faster than I should have on those roads. The clerk was half asleep behind the counter and looked at me like I was out of my mind when I told him I needed to use the phone. I called 911 and told the dispatcher what I'd seen: the woman, the nightgown, the bare feet, the stretch of Route 9 about 2 miles west of the Brenton Junction. The dispatcher said they'd send someone. I bought a coffee and waited. About 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy pulled into the lot and came inside. He was an older man, mid-50s maybe, with a weathered face and a calm that felt practiced, like he'd been to enough strange calls that nothing surprised him anymore. He asked me to describe what I'd seen. I told him everything: the nightgown, the feet, the way she stood facing the trees, the words she said. He wrote it all down in a small notebook without much reaction. Then he drove out to the spot. I followed in my truck. She was gone. We parked on the shoulder and walked the area with flashlights. There was no one there. No footprints leading away through the gravel or the mud beyond the shoulder. No blood, no fabric, no trace that anyone had been standing there at all except for one thing. In the shallow depression where I'd seen the puddle, where her feet had been planted, there were 2 impressions in the frozen mud. Clear and deep, the size and shape of bare human feet. The puddle had iced over completely around them, locking the prints in place like a mold. The deputy crouched down and looked at them for a long time. Then he stood up, clicked off his flashlight, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You're not the first person to call this in," he said. I asked him what he meant. He told me that over the course of that winter, starting in late November, they'd received 3 other calls about a woman matching the exact same description on the exact same stretch of road. A thin white nightgown, bare feet, standing on the shoulder facing the tree line. Each caller described the same thing. She wouldn't respond. She appeared to be severely hypothermic, and when they went to get help and came back, she was gone. No trace, no footprints. Just the impressions of her feet frozen into whatever surface she'd been standing on. I asked if they'd identified her. He shook his head. I asked if they had any idea who she might be: a patient from a facility, a missing person, anyone. He shook his head again. Then he said something that I have turned over in my mind every single night since. He said it quietly, almost like he was talking to himself, like he'd forgotten I was standing there. The first report we have on file is from February of 1987. I stared at him. He didn't elaborate. He just put his notebook in his pocket, told me to drive safe, and walk back to his cruiser. I watched his taillights disappear into the fog, and then I stood there, alone on the shoulder of Route 9 inches, the freezing rain, looking at the 2 bare footprints frozen into the mud, and I felt the cold settle into me in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. That was 32 years before my call. 32 years of someone or something standing on that road in February, barefoot, in a nightgown, facing the trees, waiting for whoever told her to wait there. I still drive Route 9 on my way home from the mill. I don't have much choice. The alternative adds almost an hour to the commute, and I can't justify that 5 nights a week. But I drive it differently now. I drive it with my eyes locked straight ahead, my hands tight on the wheel, my gaze fixed on the center line. I don't look at the shoulders. I don't slow down for shapes in the fog. I don't pull over. Because the thing that scares me most isn't the woman. It's what she said. He told me to wait here. Not something told her. Not a voice, not a feeling, not a compulsion. He, a specific person. Someone she knew, or someone she trusted, or someone she feared enough to obey. Someone who told her to stand on the side of that road in the dead of winter, barefoot in the rain, and wait. And she did. For 32 years, at least. I think about who he might be. I think about what kind of hold a person or a thing would have to have over someone to make them stand in the cold until their feet turned black, until the rain pooled and froze around them, until they became more a part of the landscape than a person in it. I think about whether she's in pain. I think about whether she knows she's there. I think about whether she's still waiting right now, tonight, in the dark, in the fog, in the place where the road bends and the trees lean in close, her face turned toward the woods, her lips moving around words no one will ever hear clearly. And I think about the worst possibility of all, the one that sits in my chest like a stone and won't dissolve no matter how many times I tell myself it's impossible. That whoever told her to wait there is still out in those woods. That he's been there the whole time. That she's not waiting for someone to come. She's waiting for someone to follow her in. I drive a little faster through that stretch now, and I never ever look at the tree line. My cousin Dale and I grew up less than a mile apart in a hollow so deep and narrow that the sun didn't hit the valley floor until almost 10 in the morning, and by 3 in the afternoon it was already sliding behind the western ridge. Mingo County, West Virginia, the part of it that doesn't show up on most maps and doesn't want to. Dale's family had been on that land for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had built the original house, a rough-hewn thing that had been added onto so many times over the decades that it looked like it had grown out of the hillside rather than been placed there. My family lived just down the road, close enough that I could walk to Dale's place through the woods in 15 minutes if I cut through the laurel thicket behind the old tobacco barn. We were close the way cousins are when there aren't many other kids around. We hunted together, fished together, got in trouble together. By the time we were teenagers, we knew every ridge, every drainage, every deer trail, and old logging road within 5 miles of the house. The mountains were ours in the way that only matters when you're young and don't yet understand that the mountains don't belong to anyone. The creek was our favorite spot. It didn't have a name, none of the creeks that far back did. Not officially, but Dale's father called it Twist Creek because of the way it bent sharply around a sandstone outcrop about 4 miles in, before straightening out and running deep and slow through a stand of old hemlocks. The fishing was good there in the warmer months. Brookies mostly, nothing big, but enough to keep 2 boys busy for an afternoon. The real draw, though, wasn't the fish. It was the distance. 6 miles into the hollow, the world went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like everything had agreed to leave you alone for a while. No engine noise, no dogs barking, no voices carrying across the valley. Just the water and the wind and the sound of your own breathing. We went to the creek year-round, even when there was nothing to catch. February was our month for it, oddly enough. School was dreary, the days were short, and there was a particular kind of cabin fever that set in around midwinter that only a long walk in the cold could break. We'd pack thermoses of coffee that Dale's mother made strong enough to strip paint and hike in along the creek bed, following the frozen edges of the water where the ice was thick enough to walk on. We never saw another person out there. Not once in all the years we went. That's part of why what happened felt so wrong. That place was ours. Nothing else was supposed to be there. It was a Saturday in the 3rd week of February. I remember because Dale's birthday was coming up and I'd been thinking about what to get him, which wasn't easy when neither of us had money and the nearest store was a 40-minute drive. The weather was cold but not brutal, high 20s. Overcast, no wind to speak of. The kind of February day that feels suspended, like the world is holding its breath between winter and whatever comes next. We got to the creek around noon and settled on the bank near the sandstone outcrop, the spot we always sat. Dale had his thermos. I had mine. We weren't talking much, which was normal. One of the things I always appreciated about Dale was his comfort with silence. We could sit for an hour without saying a word, and it never felt awkward. It just felt like being in the same place at the same time, which was enough. The sound started around 1 o'clock. I noticed it first, a branch snapping somewhere on the opposite ridge, maybe 100 yards away, and about 60 feet above us. Not a sharp crack like a limb falling under the weight of ice. A slow, heavy snap, the kind made by something stepping on dead wood. Then another, rhythmic, evenly spaced, the cadence of something walking on 2 legs. I looked at Dale, and he'd already turned his head toward the sound, his thermos frozen halfway to his mouth. We both sat there and listened. The footsteps, because that's what they were, there was no pretending otherwise, moved slowly along the ridge from left to right, paralleling the creek. They weren't hurried, they weren't cautious. They had the steady, unhurried pace of something that knew exactly where it was going and wasn't concerned about being heard. The trees on that ridge were bare. It was February. Everything was stripped down to gray branches and pale bark, and even though we could hear the footsteps clearly, we couldn't see what was making them. I scanned the tree line, looked for movement, for a shape, for anything that would explain the sound. There was nothing. Just the trees and the gray sky behind them, and the sound of something walking through them with a weight and deliberateness that didn't match any animal I knew. Dale set his thermos down quietly. He picked up a rock from the creek bed, a smooth, flat stone about the size of his palm, and without saying a word, he threw it hard toward the ridge. It crashed through the underbrush and clattered against something solid. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was the kind of silence that has texture, that you can feel pressing against your eardrums. The whole hollow seemed to hold still, no birds, no water sound, no wind, just nothing. 10 seconds of nothing that stretched out like a rubber band being pulled to its limit. Then a rock came back. It didn't arc down from the ridge the way a rock would if it had been casually tossed. It came fast and flat, like a line drive, and it hit the ground between us with enough force to kick up a spray of frozen mud. It was bigger than the one Dale had thrown, rough, jagged, the size of a grapefruit. It landed no more than 2 feet from my right knee. Dale and I looked at each other. I could see it in his face, the same thing I was feeling. Not panic, not yet. Something more primitive than that. A recognition. The understanding that whatever was on that ridge wasn't an animal, wasn't a coincidence, and wasn't going to be explained away by anything comfortable. We got up. We didn't discuss it. We didn't say, "Let's go," or "We should leave." We just stood, gathered our things with the kind of controlled efficiency that comes from a deep, instinctive need to not appear afraid, and started walking back down the creek toward home. We didn't run. That was a decision we made without speaking, and I've thought about it many times since. There's something hardwired into you when you grow up in these mountains, a knowledge that running invites pursuit. You don't run from dogs. You don't run from bears. You don't run from whatever is watching you from the tree line, because running tells it that you know it's there and you're afraid, and fear is an invitation. So we walked. Fast, steady, eyes forward, boots crunching on the frozen creek bank. The footsteps started again almost immediately, on the ridge to our left, matching our pace exactly. Step for step, stride for stride, moving through the trees with that same unhurried rhythm. I could hear branches being pushed aside, undergrowth being compressed. Whatever it was big enough to displace the brush, heavy enough to snap deadfall underfoot, but I couldn't see it. Every time I glanced toward the ridge, quick, peripheral glances, because I didn't want to turn my head fully and acknowledge it, there was nothing. Just trees, just the gray lattice of bare branches against the overcast sky. Dale heard it too. I could tell by the way his shoulders had tightened, the way his jaw was set. He was walking with his hands balled into fists at his sides, his eyes locked on the trail ahead. Once, about a mile in, he muttered under his breath, "Don't look at it." I don't know if he was talking to me or to himself. The walk back should have taken about an hour and a half. It felt like 3. The footsteps never stopped, never fell behind, never surged ahead. They maintained a perfect parallel, like whatever was up there was tethered to us by an invisible line. At one point, maybe 2 miles from the house, the ridge dropped down closer to the creek, and the footsteps sounded near enough that I could hear breathing. Not panting, not exertion, just breathing. Deep and slow and measured, the way a person breathes when they're standing still, not when they're walking through rough terrain, as if it wasn't effort for it, as if it was just watching us the way we might watch something small and interesting moving along the ground. The ridge pulled away again as we got closer to Dale's property, and the footsteps receded with it, growing fainter but never disappearing entirely. When we finally broke out of the tree line and onto the cleared land behind Dale's house, I felt a relief so sharp it was almost painful, the physical sensation of a held breath being released. Dale's mother, Carol, was on the back porch. That wasn't unusual. She spent a lot of time on that porch, smoking and watching the tree line the way women in that hollow had probably watched it for 100 years. Not with fear, exactly, but with a kind of patient vigilance, the way you'd watch a dog that usually behaved, but sometimes didn't. What was unusual was her face. She was pale, not sick pale, not cold pale, scared pale. A color I'd never seen on Carol, who was one of the toughest women I'd ever known, who had once killed a copperhead on her kitchen floor with a cast iron skillet without raising her voice. She met us at the bottom of the porch steps and asked us a question that turned the blood in my veins to something cold and slow. "Why'd you send someone ahead of you?" Dale and I looked at each other. Neither of us said anything. Carol's eyes moved between us, reading our confusion, and I watched her expression shift from unsettled to something deeper. She told us that about 20 minutes before we walked out of the tree line, a man had come out of the woods at the far end of the yard. He'd stepped out from between two hemlocks at the edge of the property, the same trees we always passed on our way to and from the creek, and stood there. Just stood at the border of the cleared land, where the grass ended and the forest began. He was tall, she said, very tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that she couldn't describe in detail because the light was wrong and he was too far away. He stood there for maybe a minute, motionless, facing the house. Carol said she'd open the screen door to call out to him, and the moment she did, the very instant the door creaked on its hinges, he turned and walked back into the woods. But the way he walked was what made her voice go thin and tight as she told us. She said it was wrong. She said he moved like a person who had learned to walk by, watching other people do it, but had never quite internalized the mechanics. His arms swung, but not in time with his legs. His stride was too long for his pace, like his body was operating on two different rhythms that didn't sync up. She said it looked like a marionette being worked by someone who was almost good at it, but not quite. Close enough to pass at a distance, wrong enough to make your skin crawl up close. She asked us again who he was. We told her we didn't know. We told her about the footsteps, the rock, the sound on the ridge. She listened without interrupting, the cigarette in her hand burning down to the filter untouched. When we finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "My mother used to tell me there are things in these hollers that look like people but aren't." She said they watch from the ridges and they learn how we move and how we talk and how we walk. And sometimes they come down and try it out. She said the old rule was, you don't throw things at what you can't see, because it tells them you know they're there. And once they know you know, they get curious. She put out her cigarette and told us to come inside. She locked the back door, something I'd never seen her do in daylight, and she pulled the curtains on the windows facing the tree line. We ate dinner in the kitchen with the radio on, and nobody mentioned it again that night. Dale and I never went back to that creek. We didn't make a pact about it or have a conversation. We just stopped going. The way you stop touching a stove burner after the first time it burns you, not because someone tells you to, but because your body has already made the decision for you. I moved out of the hollow 2 years later, got a job in Beckley and an apartment that was closer to the road than to the woods. Dale stayed. He still lives in that house. I asked him once, years later, over the phone, if anything like that ever happened again. He was quiet for a beat too long, and then he said, "I don't go past the barn anymore after dark." He didn't explain what that meant, and I didn't ask. But sometimes, in that space between waking and sleeping, I see it the way Carol must have seen it. A tall, thin figure, stepping out of the tree line with that wrong walk, those unsynchronized limbs, standing at the edge of the yard like it was testing a boundary, like it was deciding whether to cross. And the thing that keeps me awake, the thing I keep coming back to after all these years, isn't the footsteps on the ridge or the rock that came flying back at us, or even the breathing I heard when the ridge came close. It's the timing. Carol said the man walked out of the woods 20 minutes before we got home. That means whatever was following us on the ridge wasn't just keeping pace with us. At some point, it had moved ahead. It had outrun us without us hearing it change speed, had come down off the ridge, and had arrived at the house before we did. It had stood in the yard, in the open, in the daylight, and looked at the house where we were going. It knew where we lived. It had always known. It was never following us to the creek. It was following us home. The cabin was Marcus's idea. He found it on one of those rental-by-owner websites, the kind where people list hunting shacks and fishing camps that are too remote or too rough for the mainstream platforms. He sent me the listing with a text that said, 5 nights, $200 total, you in? And I said yes before I even looked at the pictures. $200 for a week in the mountains in early February. I didn't care what it looked like. I was 3 months out of a job I'd hated for 4 years, burning through savings, and the idea of disappearing into the West Virginia backcountry for a few days felt like the only thing that made sense. Marcus and I had been friends since college. He was the kind of person who could talk to anyone, sleep anywhere, and find something to laugh about in situations that would make most people miserable. He was steady, grounded. I mention that because it matters later, because what happened to Marcus in that cabin wasn't something that happens to people like him. It was something that happened to him despite who he was, and that's what makes it so hard to explain. We drove up on a Sunday afternoon in the first week of February. The directions the owner had emailed were vague: turn off the county road at the leaning mailbox, follow the gravel for 3 miles, bear left at the split, keep going until you see it. The last mile was barely a road at all, just 2 tire ruts carved through the mud with weeds growing up the center strip. The trees closed in tight on both sides, bare branches interlocking overhead like the ribs of something long dead. By the time we reached the cabin, the afternoon light had gone flat and gray, and the place sat in a small clearing that felt more like a gap in the forest's attention than a deliberate opening. The cabin itself was about what you'd expect for $200. 1 story, maybe 600 square feet, with a covered porch that sagged on one end and a tin roof streaked with rust. Inside, there was a main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area along the back wall, and a side room with 2 cots pushed against opposite walls. The furniture was mismatched: a folding table, 2 metal chairs, a plywood counter. Everything was functional, nothing was comfortable, and the whole place had that feeling of being used but not cared for, like a tool that gets put away wet. But the smell was the first thing I noticed. Before the sagging porch, before the rust, before any of it, the moment I opened the truck door, I caught it faint, metallic, like copper pennies or wet iron. The kind of smell that sits at the back of your throat and stays there. It got stronger inside. Not overwhelming, not rotten, just persistent. A thin, mineral presence that seemed to bleed from the walls themselves, as if the wood had absorbed something a long time ago and was slowly exhaling it. Marcus noticed it too. He wrinkled his nose and said it was probably the plumbing. The cabin had a hand pump in the kitchen connected to a well, and old wells sometimes threw off a sulfur or iron smell. Or maybe a mouse had died in the walls, he said. It happens. We opened the windows for an hour to air the place out. The smell faded to a background hum, something you could ignore if you weren't thinking about it. We unpacked, got the wood stove going, and settled in. The first 2 days were good. Better than good. We hiked ridgelines, cooked canned chili on the wood stove, played cards by lantern light until our eyes got heavy. The weather was cold but dry, and the woods around the cabin were beautiful in that stark, skeletal way that February forests are: all contrast, all bone, the architecture of the trees laid bare against the white sky. We didn't see another person. We didn't hear another engine. It was exactly what I'd needed. And by the second night, I was sleeping deeper than I had in months. The third night is when it started. I woke up sometime after 3. Not gradually all at once. The way you wake up when something is wrong but you don't know what yet. The wood stove had burned low, and the cabin was cold enough that I could see my breath. The lantern was out. The only light came from the embers glowing behind the stove grate, casting a dim orange wash across the floor that didn't reach the walls. I looked over at Marcus's cot. It was empty. The sleeping bag was pushed back, and the cot was still holding the impression of his body. The fabric creased where his weight had been. I sat up and listened. The cabin was quiet, no wind, no creaking, no animal sounds outside. Just the faint tick of the stove cooling and something else, a presence, the feeling of someone standing nearby in the dark, occupying space, displacing air. I found him in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with his back to me, facing the wall, perfectly still. His arms were at his sides, his feet bare on the cold floor, his head tilted slightly forward as if he were reading something written on the wall at eye level. He was wearing the same t-shirt and shorts he'd gone to bed in. "Marcus," I said. Nothing. No movement, no acknowledgement. He stood there like a photograph of himself. "Marcus," louder this time. Still nothing. I could see his back rising and falling with slow, even breaths. So he was alive. He was breathing, but he wasn't there. Not in the way that mattered. "Marcus," I was almost shouting now, and the sound of my own voice in that small, dark cabin startled me more than his silence. He flinched, his shoulders twitched, and then he turned around slowly, blinking, his face slack with confusion. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you've just been pulled out of deep water, disoriented, gasping for context. "What?" he said. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in hours. "You were standing in the kitchen," I said. "Just standing there, facing the wall." He looked around, looked down at his bare feet on the cold floor, looked back at me. I don't remember getting up." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I was asleep. I was just asleep." He said it twice, like he was trying to convince himself. We went back to bed. Marcus fell asleep within minutes, but I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the cabin settle around me. The copper smell seemed stronger in the dark. It came in waves, like breathing. In the morning, I found the scratches. They were on the inside of the front door, down low, about 2 feet from the floor. Deep gouges in the soft wood, 5 parallel lines scored into the surface, each one maybe 4 inches long. They hadn't been there before, I was sure of it, because I'd leaned against that door the previous evening while Marcus dealt cards, and I would have felt them against my back. They were fresh. The wood inside the grooves was pale and raw, not yet darkened by air. I showed Marcus. He stared at them with an expression I couldn't read, not fear, not confusion, something more like recognition, like he was seeing something he'd expected but hoped wouldn't be there. He touched the grooves with his fingertips and didn't say anything. That's when I looked at his hands. His fingernails, normally clean, he was meticulous about things like that, were packed with dirt, not surface grime. Deep, dark material wedged under each nail, the kind of thing you'd see on someone who'd been digging in soil with their bare hands, or clawing at wood. I didn't say anything about it. I don't know why. Maybe because saying it would make it real, and I wasn't ready for it to be real yet. Marcus went to wash his hands, and I heard him scrubbing at the pump for a long time, longer than necessary, the water splashing and splashing in the tin basin. We spent the day outside. We hiked further than we had the previous days, pushing along a ridge trail that took us a couple of miles from the cabin before looping back. We talked about normal things: football, a mutual friend's wedding, whether Marcus should take a job offer he'd been sitting on. We didn't talk about the night before. The scratches on the door sat between us like a third person at the table, present and unacknowledged. That evening, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sleep. I was going to stay awake and watch. If Marcus got up again, I wanted to see it happen from the beginning. I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before deciding what to do about it. We turned in around 10. Marcus read for a while by flashlight, then clicked it off and rolled over. I lay on my cot with my eyes open, breathing slowly, counting the minutes by the rhythm of the stove's ticking. The copper smell was back, thicker now, almost sweet at the edges, like something organic was breaking down beneath the mineral sharpness. I breathed through my mouth and watched the dark. The hours crawled. Midnight, 1, 2. The cabin contracted in the cold, popping and groaning like an old man's joints. Outside, an owl called once from somewhere far away and didn't call again. Marcus slept soundly, his breathing deep and regular, the sleep of someone with nothing on his conscience. I started to doubt myself. Maybe the kitchen thing had been ordinary sleepwalking. Maybe the scratches had been there all along and I'd missed them. Maybe I was manufacturing a crisis because my life felt so out of control that I needed one I could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." "Atria, 15 Marcus sat up. It wasn't the gradual, groggy movement of someone waking up. It was mechanical. His upper body rose from the cot in one smooth motion, like a hinge closing in reverse, until he was sitting perfectly upright with his legs still under the sleeping bag. His eyes were open. I could see the faint reflected glow of the stove embers in them, 2 small orange points in the dark. But they weren't tracking anything. They were fixed straight ahead, locked on the front door across the room, unblinking. He sat like that for maybe 30 seconds. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I watched him the way you watch something you don't understand yet, with every sense pulled taut, waiting for the next piece of information that will tell you whether to act or stay still. He pushed the sleeping bag off and stood up. His movements were fluid but wrong too smooth, too coordinated for someone who was supposedly asleep. There was no stumbling, no hesitation. He walked across the cabin to the front door, with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had been there many times before. He stopped in front of the door. He raised both hands and placed his palms flat against the wood, fingers spread. Then he leaned forward and pressed his face against the door, his forehead and cheek and mouth flush against the surface, like he was trying to push through it, like he was trying to merge with it. And then he whispered. It was so quiet that I almost missed it. Would have missed it if the cabin hadn't been as silent as a sealed tomb. But I heard it, clear and calm and spoken, in a voice that was Marcus's but wasn't a version of his voice, with the personality drained out, flat and thin, like words being spoken through a wall. "Let me out. I'm ready." I was off the cot before I made the conscious decision to move. I crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed him by both shoulders, pulling him back from the door. His body was rigid, locked into position, and for a terrible second he didn't budge. It was like trying to move a man made of wood. Then something released, some internal switch flipped, and he sagged in my grip and came alive all at once, gasping, his eyes suddenly present and terrified, his hands flying up to grab my arms. What's happening? His voice was shaking. He looked at the door, looked at his hands still raised at chest level, looked at me. Why am I at the door? Was I asleep? You were sleepwalking, I said. And even as the words came out, I knew they were insufficient, knew they didn't cover what I'd just seen. People who sleepwalk bump into furniture and wander hallways. They don't press their faces against doors and whisper that they're ready. Marcus was trembling, not from the cold, from something deeper, something his body understood even if his conscious mind didn't. He kept looking at his hands, turning them over, examining them as if they belonged to someone else. I checked his fingernails. The dirt was back, packed deep, dark and moist. The scratches on the inside of the door had company now, fresh marks alongside the ones from the night before, slightly lower, slightly deeper. We didn't go back to bed. We sat at the folding table with the lantern on, and the wood stove opened up to throw as much light as possible. Marcus didn't talk much. He sat with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring at the door with an expression that was closer to grief than fear. At one point, he said quietly, almost to himself, "It felt like someone was calling me, like someone was on the other side of the door, and they needed me to come outside." He paused. "Not someone I know, someone I was supposed to know, like I'd been keeping them waiting." We left at first light, packed the truck in 10 minutes, didn't bother cleaning up, didn't sweep or close the windows or leave the key where the owner had asked. We drove down that wretched gravel track in silence and didn't speak until we hit the county road. Marcus turned the radio on and found a country station playing something loud and forgettable, and we let it fill the cab and push the silence out. I didn't tell Marcus what I found when I looked up the cabin's history. I waited until I was home, alone, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, telling myself I was being paranoid. It took about 2 hours of searching county records and archived local news before I found it. A man named Gerald Pritt had rented that same cabin in January of 2004. He was a school teacher from Beckley, recently separated, looking for a place to be alone for a while. He arrived on a Friday. By the following Wednesday, he was gone. His car was still in the clearing, his clothes were still inside, his wallet was on the counter, but Gerald Pritt was nowhere. The search went on for weeks. They brought dogs, brought volunteers, combed the ridgelines in every direction. They found nothing. No body, no trail, no evidence of foul play. The only physical trace Gerald Pritt left behind was on the front door of the cabin. The investigating officer's report described deep scratch marks on the interior surface of the door, concentrated around the latch and the lower panels. The wood had been gouged so deeply in places that it had splintered through to the other side. And embedded in those gouges, pressed into the raw wood like fossils in stone, they found fingernails. Human fingernails, torn from their beds, left behind by someone who had clawed at that door with a desperation that went beyond anything rational. The report didn't speculate on why a man would try to scratch his way out of a cabin whose door wasn't locked. It didn't have to. Some questions are worse when they're answered. I never told Marcus. He called me a few weeks after the trip, sounding normal, sounding like himself. He said he'd been sleeping fine. He said he hadn't had any more episodes. He asked if I wanted to plan another trip somewhere, maybe in the spring. I said sure and changed the subject. But there are nights when I lie awake and think about what he said at that table, with the lantern burning and the copper smell thick in the air. Someone on the other side of the door, someone he was supposed to know, someone he'd been keeping waiting. And I think about Gerald Pritt, alone in that cabin 13 years before us, clawing at a door that wasn't locked, trying to get out or trying to get to whatever was calling him from the other side. I think about whether he finally opened it, whether he walked out into the dark and the trees, barefoot and glassy-eyed, following a voice only he could hear towards something he was ready for but shouldn't have been. And I think about the copper smell, how it was already there when we arrived, baked into the walls, rising from the floor, how it never went away no matter how many windows we opened, how it was strongest at night when the cabin cooled and the wood contracted and whatever was sealed inside those walls breathed out in the dark. I know what copper smells like in large quantities. Everyone does, even if they don't want to admit it. It smells like blood, old blood, the kind that soaks into wood and never comes out, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many coats of varnish you put over it. The cabin is still listed on that website. I checked last month. The price is the same, $200 for 5 nights, no reviews. I think about who might be there right now, sleeping on that cot, breathing that air. I think about whether they'll wake up at 3:15 with their hands against the door and a voice in their head telling them they're ready. And I think about what happens to the ones who actually open it. I've been carrying mail in Randolph County, West Virginia, for 11 years. Rural route, which means I'm not walking a sidewalk in town dropping letters through slots. I'm driving a right-hand drive Jeep Cherokee along 40 miles of mountain roads, some paved, most not, delivering to mailboxes that are nailed to fence posts and leaning trees and, in one case, bolted to the rusted frame of a tractor that hasn't moved since the Johnson administration. The route covers 3 hollers, 2 ridgelines, and a stretch of river valley that floods every spring like clockwork. I know every curve, every pothole, every dog that's going to chase the truck, and every dog that's going to let me pass. I know which houses get packages, which houses only get bills, and which houses get nothing at all for weeks at a time because the people inside have either left or stopped caring about the outside world. It's a solitary job, and I like it that way. You learn the rhythm of these mountains when you drive them every day. You learn how the light changes between October and March, how the shadows stretch and compress, how the hollers go from green and alive to gray and silent as the year turns. You learn the sounds, too, the ones that belong and the ones that don't. After 11 years, I can tell the difference between a branch falling and a deer stepping through brush at 200 yards. I can tell when a creek is running normal and when it's rising. I can tell when the silence is natural and when it's the kind of silence that means something nearby has made everything else go quiet. February is the worst month on the route. It's not the coldest. January holds that title, but it's the most oppressive. The days are short and gray, the roads are perpetually glazed with black ice, and the fog comes in off the river valley and sits in the hollers like something that's moved in and isn't planning to leave. Some mornings, it's so thick that I can't see the mailbox until I'm right on top of it. I drive with my hazards on and my window cracked so I can listen for oncoming traffic, because headlights are useless when the air itself has turned to milk. The old-timers around here call February the dead month, not because of the cold, because of how still everything gets. Like the mountains are holding something in their lungs and waiting to see if it's going to pass. The stretch of road where it happened is called Dalton Run, though I doubt you'd find that name on any official map. It's a 2-mile gravel road that branches off the county route and winds along the edge of a ravine before dead-ending at a hollow where about 12 families live, most of them related to each other by blood or marriage or both. The ravine drops off sharp on the left side of the road, maybe 80 feet down to the creek at the bottom, steep enough that if you went off the edge, you'd roll before you'd slide. The right side is a wall of hillside, thick with rhododendron and hemlock, the kind of growth that stays green even in February and makes the road feel like a tunnel. It was a Tuesday morning, somewhere around 9:30. I remember because I was running behind the ice, had slowed me down on the first half of the route, and I was trying to make up time. The fog on Dalton Run was the worst I'd seen it all winter. It wasn't the wispy, drifting kind that burns off by mid-morning. It was solid, dense, a wall of white-gray, nothing that started about 4 feet off the ground and went straight up as far as I could tell. My headlights just reflected back at me, so I turned them off and relied on the fog lights, which cast a low yellow glow across the gravel about 10 feet ahead of the bumper. Beyond that, the world simply stopped existing. I was about halfway through the run, maybe a quarter mile past the Hadley mailbox, when I heard the voice. It came from below the road, down in the ravine, somewhere in the fog below the drop-off. A child's voice, young, maybe 8 or 9, the kind of voice that hasn't settled yet, still high and clear, and it was calling for help. "Please, I'm down here. Please help me." I took my foot off the gas and let the truck roll to a stop. I sat there with the engine idling, both hands on the wheel, listening. The fog pressed against the windows like something alive. The voice came again, fainter this time, like the child had moved further down the slope or was losing strength. "Please, I'm down here. Please help me." Same words, same inflection, same cadence. Every syllable identical to the first time, like a sentence being read from a card. I put the truck in park and got out. The cold hit me immediately. It's always worse inside the fog, like the moisture carries the temperature deeper into your skin. I walked to the left edge of the road, where the gravel gave way to a thin strip of dead grass before the ground dropped away into the ravine. I couldn't see the bottom. I couldn't see 10 feet down. Just the fog, thick and still, filling the ravine like water fills a bowl. "Hello?" I called out. "Where are you? Can you hear me?" Silence. 5 seconds. 10. Then the voice, rising up from the fog below like it was climbing toward me. "Please, I'm down here. Please help me." My heart was going. A child in that ravine, in this cold, in this fog, they'd be hypothermic in an hour if they weren't already. I took a step off the road, putting my right foot on the slope. The ground was slick with frost and dead leaves, and I immediately felt my boots start to slide. I grabbed a rhododendron branch to steady myself and leaned forward, peering down into the white nothing. "I'm coming," I called. "Keep talking so I can find you. Tell me where you are." Nothing. The fog absorbed my voice the way water absorbs a stone, a brief ripple, and then gone. I waited. I was about to call out again when I heard it. The voice, behind me, up on the road, near my truck. "Please, I'm down here. Please help me." The exact same voice, the exact same words, the exact same cadence, the exact same pitch. Not an echo. There was no delay, no distortion, no spatial quality that would suggest the sound had bounced off something and come back. It was the same sentence, played from a different location, like someone had picked up a speaker and moved it, like someone had taken the recording and pressed play from 20 feet behind me, up on the gravel, right next to the driver's side door of my Jeep. I turned around slowly. The fog was so thick on the road that I could barely make out the shape of my truck, just the vague dark outline of it sitting on the gravel with its hazard lights pulsing a dim orange. There was no child on the road. There was nothing on the road, but the voice had been there, right there, close enough that if I'd been standing next to the truck instead of on the slope, I could have reached out and touched whoever was speaking. I don't remember making a decision. My body made it for me, the same way your hand pulls back from a hot surface before your brain registers the heat. I was off the slope and back on the road in 2 steps, in the truck in 3, and I had it in drive before I'd even pulled the door all the way shut. I drove the rest of Dalton Run without stopping, delivering the remaining mailboxes by barely slowing down and shoving the mail in with one hand while the other kept the wheel steady. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped 2 packages in the mud and didn't go back for them. The last house on the run belonged to a woman named Edith Combs. She was in her 70s, lived alone, and had one of those mailboxes at the end of a long dirt driveway that meant I usually just left her mail and moved on. But that morning, I needed a phone. Cell signal was non-existent on Dalton Run. It always was, and I needed to call the sheriff's office because, despite what I'd heard, despite the wrongness of it, there was still a possibility that a real child was down in that ravine. I couldn't live with myself if I drove away and a kid died because I got spooked by fog. Edith was on her porch when I pulled up, which surprised me. She wasn't the type to sit outside in February. She was wrapped in a heavy coat with a wool scarf pulled up to her chin, sitting in a metal rocking chair with a mug of something steaming in her hands, and she was watching me in a way that made me feel like she'd been expecting me. I told her what I'd heard. I asked to use her phone. She listened without interrupting, her eyes steady on my face, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she set her mug down on the porch railing and said very calmly, "You didn't go down the slope, did you?" I told her I'd taken 1 step down but came back when I heard the voice behind me. She nodded slowly, and something in her face loosened, not quite relief, but close to it. The way you look when someone tells you they almost stepped on a snake but saw it in time. She let me use her phone. I called the sheriff's office and told the dispatcher what I'd heard. They said they'd send someone to check the ravine. I gave them the approximate location and hung up. When I came back out to the porch, Edith was standing at the railing, looking down the road toward the stretch where I'd stopped, even though it was invisible in the fog. She told me the sheriff's people wouldn't find anything. She said it with certainty, the way you'd say the sun won't rise in the west. Then she told me why. People had been hearing that voice on Dalton Run for as long as she could remember, always in February, always during the fog, always in the same stretch of road above the deepest part of the ravine. Her grandmother had heard it in the early 1960s, walking the road on foot before it was even graveled. A child's voice, calling from below, asking for help. Her grandmother had started down the slope before her husband grabbed her arm and pulled her back. He'd heard it too, but he'd also heard it shift, the same voice, appearing suddenly from a different direction, too quickly, too cleanly, as if the sound itself had moved rather than its source. Edith said the old people on Dalton Run had a word for it. They called it a lure. Not a ghost, not a spirit, not a demon. They were specific about that distinction. A lure. Something that mimicked a sound designed to draw a person off the road and down into the ravine. Something that used a child's voice, because a child's voice is the one thing almost any person will respond to without thinking. The one sound that bypasses every rational calculation and goes straight to the part of your brain that says, move, help, now. I asked her what happened to people who followed it down. She looked at me for a long time, the fog moving behind her like a living curtain, and said, they don't come back up. I asked her what she meant. She said it simply, without drama. Over the decades, people had gone into that ravine and not returned. Not many, one every few years, maybe, and not always in February, but usually, the searches would find nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign that anyone had been there. The ravine wasn't that deep, the creek at the bottom wasn't that fast, and there was nowhere a person could go that dogs couldn't follow. But the dogs would lose the trail at the edge of the road every time. The scent would just end, as if the person had evaporated at the point where the gravel met the slope. She said her grandmother's theory was that the lure wasn't coming from the ravine at all. It was coming from something in the fog itself. Something that used the ravine the way a fisherman uses water, as a place where the thing you're catching is already out of its element, already disoriented, already unable to get back to solid ground, once it realizes something is wrong. The fog was the medium, the voice was the bait, and the ravine was just the place where the line went tight. The sheriff's deputy called me back that afternoon. They'd searched the ravine for 2 hours. No child, no tracks, no sign of anyone. He asked if I was sure about what I'd heard. I told him I was. He made a note and closed the report. I still drive Dalton Run every day. I don't have a choice, those 12 families need their mail, and I'm the only carrier on the route. But I drive it differently in February now. I keep the windows up. I keep the radio on, louder than I'd normally want it. And when the fog comes in thick and the ravine disappears into white silence on my left, I do not slow down. There was one morning, about 3 weeks after that first time, when I almost broke my own rule. The fog was back, dense as cotton, and I was passing through the same stretch when I heard it again. The same voice, the same words, the same pleading cadence. Please. I'm down here. Please help me. It came from below the road, faint and desperate, and every instinct I had told me to stop, to get out, to help. But then I heard something I hadn't heard the first time. Something I might have heard if I'd stayed longer, if I'd taken another step down the slope, if I'd committed to the descent instead of turning back. Underneath the child's voice, barely audible, like a sound playing on a second track just below the volume of the first, I heard breathing. Slow, deep, deliberate breathing that had nothing to do with a child. It was the breathing of something large and patient, something that was listening just as hard as I was, something that was waiting in the fog with its mouth open, using a voice that didn't belong to it to say words it didn't understand. I pressed the gas and didn't let up until I was off Dalton Run entirely. Edith Combs passed away last November. Heart failure, peaceful, in her sleep. I delivered her mail for 11 years, and in all that time, she only mentioned the voice to me twice that first morning, and once more the following February, when she stopped me at her mailbox and asked, quietly, if I'd heard it again. I told her I had. She nodded and said, "Don't ever answer it with your name. That's what my grandmother said. Whatever you do, don't let it know your name." I didn't ask why. Some things you don't need explained. Some instructions make more sense the less you understand them, because understanding would require you to accept a reality that the daylight part of your mind isn't built to hold. February is here again, the fog is back, and yesterday morning, on Dalton Run, about halfway through the stretch above the ravine, I heard the voice. Same words, same child, same desperate plea rising out of the white nothing below the road. But this time, there was a difference, a small one that made me grip the steering wheel until my knuckles went white and my vision blurred at the edges. This time, the voice used my name. The three of us had been planning the trip since October. Me, Kyle, and Nate, friends since high school, all in our early 30s now, all reaching that point in life where the thing you need most is the thing you can least afford, which is time away from everything. Kyle was a paramedic in Charleston. Nate managed a hardware store in Lewisburg. I drove a delivery truck for a food distributor, running cases of frozen chicken and canned vegetables to restaurants across 3 counties. We weren't the kind of guys who used words like burnout, but we all had it. You could see it in the way we talked about the trip, not with excitement, but with relief, the way a drowning person talks about shore. The plan was 3 days on a ridge trail in the Monongahela National Forest, a section that ran along the spine of a long, narrow mountain between 2 river valleys. It wasn't a popular trail, especially not in February. The summer hikers and leaf peepers were long gone, and the hunting seasons were mostly closed. We'd have the ridge to ourselves, which was the whole point. 3 days of walking, camping, and not thinking about the flatland world we'd left at the trailhead. We started on a Friday morning. The weather was cooperating cold, mid-20s, but the sky was clear and the wind was manageable. The trail climbed steeply for the first mile, switchbacking through a stand of bare hardwoods before cresting the ridge and leveling out into a long, rolling track that followed the mountain's backbone. The views were extraordinary. On both sides, the land dropped away into deep valleys choked with fog, and the surrounding ridges stretched out in every direction, layered on top of each other like the folds of a gray blanket. Up on top, above the fog, the air was sharp and clean and the sun hit you full on. It felt like walking on the roof of the world. The first day was easy. We covered about 7 miles and made camp in a sheltered spot just below the ridgeline, out of the wind. We cooked dinner over a small stove, talked about nothing important, and turned in early. The stars that night were staggering, no light pollution for miles. The Milky Way so bright it cast faint shadows on the ground. I fell asleep feeling something close to peace for the first time in months. Saturday started the same way. Clear sky, cold air, the trail stretching ahead like a pale ribbon through the winter-stripped forest. We broke camp early and were moving by 8. The plan was to cover another 7 or 8 miles and camp at a spot Kyle had marked on his map, a flat area near a spring that was supposedly reliable year-round. We found the camp around noon. It was about 30 yards off the trail, in a small natural clearing where a cluster of hemlocks created a partial windbreak on 3 sides. We almost walked past it. The trail curved right at that point, and the clearing was on the left, partially obscured by a low stand of mountain laurel. Nate saw it first. He stopped and said, "Someone set up," and pointed through the brush. At first glance, it looked normal. A 2-person tent, olive green, set up neatly on a patch of level ground. A folding camp chair positioned beside a ring of stones that served as a fire pit, though there was no fire and the ash inside the ring looked cold. A small propane stove sat on a flat rock near the chair, and on top of the stove was a pot of water. Standard camp setup. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Except the stove was on. We could hear it, a low, steady hiss, the sound of propane feeding a flame turned down to its minimum. The blue ring of fire under the pot was barely visible in the daylight, but it was there. The water in the pot was warm, not boiling, not simmering, just warm to the touch, which meant someone had lit the stove, put on water, and then left before it reached a boil. Or someone had lit the stove a long time ago and the water had boiled, cooled, and was now being kept at a tepid hold by the low flame. Either way, someone had been here recently enough to start a fire, and they hadn't come back to use it. "Hello?" Kyle called out. His voice carried through the clearing and into the trees beyond, flat and echoless, absorbed by the cold air. "Anyone here?" Nothing. No response. No movement. No sound except the hiss of the stove and the faint creak of branches overhead. We looked at each other. The same thought was passing between all 3 of us. Without anyone saying it, this was someone's camp. They'd stepped away. They'd be back any minute. People leave camp all the time. They go to filter water, to use the bathroom, to stretch their legs. It didn't have to mean anything. But something about it felt wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic way. Not the kind of wrong that makes you grab a weapon or run. Wrong in a quiet way. A stillness that went deeper than the absence of a person. The camp chair was angled toward the tree line, not toward the fire pit, as if whoever had been sitting in it hadn't been warming themselves or cooking but watching something in the woods. The tent was zipped shut all the way, both the outer fly and the inner mesh, sealed tight. The way you close a tent when you're leaving for the day, not when you're stepping out for 5 minutes. Kyle walked to the tent and unzipped it. I stood behind him and looked over his shoulder. Inside, a sleeping bag was laid out on a foam pad, smooth flat, the zipper pulled up to the top. A pair of hiking boots sat next to the pad, placed together, laces tucked inside, the soles clean. Not worn clean, actually clean, as if someone had brushed the dirt off them before placing them down. A headlamp hung from the tent's ceiling loop. A small dry bag sat in the corner, and next to it, open and face up, was a journal. It was a cheap composition notebook, the kind you can buy at any drugstore, black and white marble pattern on the cover. It was open to a page about 2/3 of the way through. The handwriting was neat, small, slightly slanted to the right. The entry was dated 2 days prior, the previous Thursday. It read, Day 4. It came back to the tree line tonight. Closer than before. I think it knows I've been watching. I'm going to try to make contact. That was it, one paragraph. The rest of the page was blank. I reached down and turned to the next page. Blank. The page after that. Blank. Every page from that entry to the back cover was empty. I flipped backward through the journal. The earlier entries were there. I skimmed them quickly, registering bits and pieces. Day 1 described arriving at the trailhead, the weather, the hike-in. Day 2 mentioned hearing sounds at night, branches breaking on the slope below the clearing. Day 3 was longer, more agitated. It described something standing at the edge of the tree line after dark, visible only as a shape, a silhouette that was slightly too tall and slightly too narrow, standing motionless among the hemlocks. The writer said they'd watched it through the tent mesh for over an hour. It hadn't moved. It had simply stood there, and then, at some point that the writer couldn't identify, they'd blinked, or looked away for a second, or the darkness had shifted, it was gone. Day 4 was the last entry. I'm going to try to make contact. I set the journal down and backed out of the tent. Nate was standing by the stove, looking at the tree line with an expression I recognized from hunting trips, the focused, still-faced alertness of someone who senses they're not alone but can't confirm it. We should look around, Kyle said. He was already scanning the perimeter of the clearing, his eyes moving systematically from one edge to the next. Kyle was always like that. Methodical, the paramedic in him. Assess, prioritize, act. We searched for about 20 minutes. We walked the edges of the clearing, checked behind the hemlocks, followed the trail in both directions for 100 yards. We looked for footprints, for broken branches, for any sign that someone had walked away from this camp in any direction. The ground was cold and hard, not ideal for tracking, but it wasn't frozen solid. A boot would have left an impression in the leaf litter and thin mud. There was nothing. No tracks leading away from the camp, no scattered gear, no torn fabric caught on branches, no signs of a struggle or a fall or a hurried departure. The camp was intact, composed, orderly. The boots in the tent were clean. The sleeping bag was smooth. The stove was still hissing. It looked like a display, like someone had set up the perfect camp and then been lifted straight out of it, removed from the scene without disturbing a single object. The only tracks we found were our own. Kyle turned off the stove. We stood in the clearing for a few minutes, none of us saying much. The wind had picked up, and the hemlocks were swaying, their branches making a sound like slow breathing. The camp chair sat empty, still angled toward the tree line, and I kept looking at it, kept imagining the person who had sat there night after night, watching the edge of the woods, waiting for something to come closer. We hiked out the next morning, cut the trip short by a day. Nobody argued about it, nobody questioned the decision. We just packed up our own camp and walked back along the ridge in a silence that felt heavier than anything we'd carried in on our backs. At the trailhead, there was a small ranger station, really just a wooden kiosk with a window and a cramped office behind it. A ranger was on duty, a middle-aged man with a quiet manner and a face that looked like it had spent more time outdoors than in. Kyle told him what we'd found, described the camp, the stove, the tent, the journal, gave him the approximate location. The ranger wrote it down. He asked a few follow-up questions, the color of the tent, the brand of the stove, whether we'd seen any vehicles at the trailhead that might belong to the camper. We hadn't. The parking area had been empty when we'd arrived on Friday, and was empty now except for Kyle's truck. When Kyle finished, the ranger set his pen down and looked at us for a moment. His expression wasn't alarmed, It wasn't even particularly interested. It was the expression of someone hearing a story they've heard before, recognizing the shape of it, knowing how it ends. "We'll send someone up to check it out," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "This kind of thing happens up there more than you'd think." Nate asked what he meant. The ranger leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. He said that over the past several years, they'd found abandoned camps along that section of ridge with some regularity, always in winter, mostly in January or February. The pattern was always the same. Tent set up, gear in order, personal belongings still inside, no sign of the camper, no indication of where they'd gone or why. He said the strange part wasn't that people disappeared. People disappear in the wilderness all the time, for all kinds of reasons. Exposure, falls, poor decisions, bad luck. The strange part was that nobody came looking for them. No families filed missing persons reports. No friends called the ranger station asking if someone had checked in at the trailhead. No cars sat unclaimed in the parking lot. Whoever these people were, they appeared to have no one. No connections, no ties, no one in the world who would notice they hadn't come home. "It's like they come up here because there's nothing left down there," the ranger said. He said it plainly, without judgment, the way you describe the weather. "And then they go somewhere else." Kyle asked where. The ranger shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" We drove home. Kyle dropped me off first, then Nate. We said the usual things: "Good trip, let's do it again, drive safe." Nobody mentioned the camp. Nobody mentioned the journal. But I've thought about it every day since. And the thing I keep circling back to isn't the abandonment or the mystery, or even the journal entry about making contact. It's the boots. Those clean, carefully placed boots, sitting inside the tent, with the laces tucked in. Because I've been backpacking enough times to know that you don't take your boots off unless you're in for the night. You don't clean them and set them together like that unless you're done walking. Whoever that person was, they didn't leave camp in a hurry. They didn't wander off disoriented. They took off their boots, placed them neatly, and then they left the tent, barefoot, in February, in the mountains. They walked out into the cold and the dark, toward whatever they'd been watching at the tree line, without any intention of walking back. And the last line of that journal has stayed with me the way some things do, not fading, not softening, just sitting in the back of my mind like a stone at the bottom of a clear creek, always visible, always exactly where I left it. I'm going to try to make contact. Not, I'm going to investigate. Not, I'm going to see what it is. Contact. The word you use when you believe something is there, and you want it to know you're there too. The word you use when you've been watching long enough that watching isn't enough anymore. I think about the ranger saying nobody ever comes looking. I think about someone packing a tent and a stove and a journal and driving to a trailhead in the dead of winter with no one to tell and no one to miss them. I think about what it means to be that alone, alone enough that the thing standing at the tree line in the dark, the thing that comes closer each night, starts to feel less like a threat and more like an answer. Less like something to run from and more like something that finally, after all that silence, is paying attention. I don't know what was at the edge of that clearing. I don't know what our campers saw, or thought they saw, or wanted to see. But I know what the camp looked like when we found it, still, composed, at peace, like the last act of someone who had made a decision and wasn't afraid of it. And that's the part that frightens me most. Not that something was out there in the dark, but that someone went to meet it willingly, and that the place they left behind looked not like a scene of horror, but like a room that had been tidied before a long-expected guest finally arrived. The church didn't have a name, not an official one anyway. People around Knott County just called it the Laurel Fork Church, because that's where it sat on a flat patch of ground at the mouth of Laurel Fork Hollow, where the creek came down off the mountain and the road bent sharply before climbing again. It was a small building, maybe 30 feet long and 20 wide, white clapboard siding that had been repainted so many times over the decades that the wood underneath was more paint than grain. One room, 12 pews, a pulpit made from a single slab of walnut that somebody's great-grandfather had cut and planed by hand. No electricity until the 1970s, and even after they ran power to it, the only fixtures were two bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling on cloth-wrapped cord. In winter, the place was heated by a wood stove in the back corner, a cast-iron barrel type that threw good heat for about 6 feet in every direction and left the rest of the building cold enough to see your breath. My Uncle Raymond was a deacon there for as long as I can remember. He wasn't ordained, nobody at Laurel Fork was. It was an independent congregation, maybe 25 members at its peak, the kind of church that existed because the people who attended it had always attended it, going back generations, and the idea of driving an hour to a bigger church in town felt like a kind of betrayal. Raymond took the role seriously. He opened the building for services, maintained the stove, kept the roof patched and the porch from falling in. He wasn't a preacher, but he read scripture and led prayer when the circuit pastor couldn't make it, which in February was almost always, because the road to Laurel Fork became a sheet of ice from December through March, and most sensible people avoided it. February was when they held the midweek prayer services. Every Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, a small group of the faithful would gather in that freezing building and pray together. My mother started making me go when I was 12. She had her reasons. I was getting into trouble at school, running with kids she didn't approve of, developing what she called a hard heart. She thought an evening with Uncle Raymond and the church people would soften me. I think she also needed a break from worrying about me for a few hours, and sending me up the hollow with Raymond was the closest thing to a guarantee she had that I'd stay out of trouble for one night a week. I hated it. I hated the cold, the hard pews, the musty smell of old wood and damp hymnals, the way the services dragged on with the same prayers and the same readings from the same Bible that Raymond handled with a reverence I couldn't connect to. I was 12, then 13, then 14, sitting in that church every February Wednesday with my coat on and my hands in my pockets, counting the minutes until it was over. The church had a particular quality at night that I've never been able to fully describe. During the day, with sunlight coming through the 4 small windows, it was just a building, old, modest, unremarkable. But at night, with the wood stove throwing orange light across the floor and the bare bulbs casting their weak yellow glow against the ceiling, the place changed. The shadows deepened in the corners. The white walls seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. And the floor-wide pine planks, original to the building, worn smooth by a century of boots and shoes, the floor seemed to breathe. Not visibly, not dramatically. It was more like a feeling, a sense that the surface you were sitting above was not solid in the way you wanted it to be, that there was space beneath it, empty, dark, waiting space. I was 14 the first time I heard it. It was the 3rd Wednesday in February. The attendance was small, even by Laurel Fork standards, maybe 9 or 10 people, all of them older, all of them bundled in coats and scarves. Raymond was leading the service because the pastor hadn't come. He was reading from Psalms, something about the valley of the shadow of death, which I remember because the words seemed particularly appropriate given how cold and dark the building was that night. The wood stove was struggling. The temperature outside was in the single digits, and the wind was coming down off the mountain in gusts that rattled the windows and pushed drafts through every gap in the clapboard. I was sitting in the second-to-last pew on the left side, as far from the pulpit as I could get without being in the back row, which was reserved for the older women who arrived early and sat together like a wall. I was doing what I always did, staring at the floor, letting Raymond's voice wash over me without registering the words, waiting for the closing prayer. That's when I heard it. Below me, beneath the floorboards, a sound that was so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it, the creak of my own shifting weight, maybe, or the wood stove settling. But it continued, and it moved. Something was dragging itself across the ground beneath the church, slowly, deliberately. Not the quick, scrabbling movement of an animal, not a possum or a raccoon or a rat. This was heavy, purposeful. It had the rhythm of a body being pulled across a dirt surface, inch by inch, with great effort and no hurry. It started from the front of the church, beneath the pulpit, and moved toward the back, passing under each row of pews with a sound like a bag of wet sand being dragged over packed earth. I could track its progress by the location of the sound. Under the first pew, under the third, under the fifth, moving in a straight line, directly beneath the center aisle, as if it knew the layout of the building above it. I stopped breathing. My whole body went tight, every muscle locked, my fingers gripping the edge of the pew so hard that the wood bit into my palms. I looked around the room. Raymond was still reading. The women in the back row had their heads bowed. Old Mr. Combs, 2 pews ahead of me, was nodding along with the scripture, his lips moving silently. Nobody was reacting. Nobody was looking at the floor. Nobody seemed to hear it. The sound passed directly beneath my pew. I felt it as much as I heard it, a vibration in the wood, a faint tremor that traveled up through the plank and into the bench, subtle enough that it could have been the stove or the wind or my own trembling. But it wasn't. It was pressure, directional pressure, moving from my left to my right, like something large passing underneath me the way a fish passes under a boat, displacing the water without breaking the surface. Then it stopped. Somewhere near the back wall, the dragging sound ceased, and the floor went still, and the only sounds in the room were Raymond's voice and the stove and the wind outside. The service continued. Nobody looked up. Nobody looked at me. I sat there for the remaining 20 minutes with my feet pulled up onto the pew, my knees against my chest, my heart hammering so loud I was afraid someone would hear it and ask me what was wrong. After the service, I waited until the others had filed out, and then I told Raymond. We were standing by the stove while he banked it for the night, the building cooling around us, our breath visible in the air. I told him I'd heard something under the floor. Something moving, something big. Raymond didn't answer right away. He finished with the stove, closed the grate, straightened up. Then he stood there for a long time, looking at the floor, his face in shadow, his expression impossible to read. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, and he didn't look at me. He told me the church was built in 1907, but the land it sat on was older than that. Before the church, there had been a structure on that spot, a root cellar, dug deep into the earth, with stone walls and a timber roof. It had been built by a family named Holbrook, who had owned the land since before the Civil War. The cellar was large for its kind, maybe 12 feet by 20, fully underground, with a single entrance that opened at ground level on the downhill side. In the 1930s, there had been a land dispute. Raymond was vague on the specifics: boundary lines, water rights, the kind of thing that turned neighbors into enemies in these mountains, and sometimes turned enemies into something worse. A man was involved. Raymond didn't say his name, or maybe he didn't know it. He said the man had been locked in the root cellar during the dispute. Whether as punishment or imprisonment or something darker, Raymond didn't say. What he said was that the man never came out. The entrance was sealed, poured concrete, mixed and laid by hand, thick enough that it might as well have been stone. The Holbrooks covered it over, graded the ground, and when the church was built on that spot 20 years later, the congregation either didn't know what was beneath them or didn't want to. The cellar became the church's crawl space, a sealed void under the floor, 12 feet by 20, dark and airless and buried. Raymond told me this the way you'd tell someone about a property line or a deed transfer, factually, calmly, without emphasis. But then his voice changed. It got quieter, and he looked at me directly for the first time since I'd started talking. He said that some winters, during February, people heard movement under the floor. Not every year, not every service, but often enough that it had become something the older members of the congregation were aware of, in the way that people become aware of things they can't explain and choose not to discuss. He said the elders didn't talk about it. When someone new mentioned it, and someone always did, eventually the elders would acknowledge it with a nod or a brief, tight-lipped look that communicated everything and nothing. And then the subject would be dropped. I asked Raymond what they thought it was. He was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, "They pray louder." That was all he would say. He ushered me out of the church, locked the door behind us, and drove me home in silence. My mother asked how the service was. I said fine. I went to bed and lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the sound of something dragging itself across the dirt 12 inches below the place where I'd been sitting. I went back the following week, and the week after that, not because I wanted to, but because my mother's will was stronger than my fear, and because some part of me, the part that picks at scabs, the part that can't leave a closed door alone, needed to know if I'd hear it again. I didn't, not that year. February ended, the midweek services stopped for the season, and the whole thing settled into a corner of my memory, where strange things go to become stories you tell yourself you might have imagined. Then February came around again. I was 15 now, old enough to drive Raymond's truck to the church while he rode in the passenger seat and pretended not to grip the dashboard. The first 2 Wednesdays were uneventful. The same prayers, the same cold, the same bare bulbs and wood stove and shadows in the corners. I'd almost forgotten about the sound, almost let it become one of those mountain things half remembered, half believed, filed under probably nothing. The third Wednesday was different. It was the coldest night of the winter. The temperature had dropped below zero by sundown, and the wind was screaming down the hollow with a force that made the church walls groan. Attendance was even thinner than usual, maybe 6 people, all committed, all old except for me. Raymond was leading again. The stove was burning hot, but the cold was winning, pressing in through every crack and seam, and I could feel it on my ankles beneath the pew like cold water rising. I didn't hear the dragging that night. I heard something else, a tapping, faint, a rhythmic, coming from directly beneath the center aisle. Not mechanical, not natural. It sounded like knuckles on wood, like someone lying face up in a tight space, raising one hand and rapping it weakly against the underside of the boards above them. It came and went, sometimes pausing for a minute or more before starting again, and each time it resumed, it seemed slightly louder, slightly more insistent. I looked at Raymond. He was reading scripture, his voice steady, his posture straight, but his knuckles were white around the Bible. His jaw was tight. He could hear it. I was certain of that. He could hear it, and he was choosing to continue, choosing to speak over it, choosing to fill the room with words that were older and louder than whatever was tapping beneath us. The tapping migrated. It moved from the center aisle toward the left side of the building, toward my side, tracking slowly along the floor until it was directly beneath my pew, beneath my feet. I could feel each tap as a tiny vibration in the plank, a pulse that traveled up through the sole of my boot and into my heel. I pulled my feet up again, pressing them onto the seat of the pew, making myself as small as possible. And then the floor moved. Not dramatically, not violently. A single plank, the one directly beneath where my feet had been bowed upward, just slightly, maybe a quarter inch. The nails at the ends of the board groaned against the joists as the wood flexed, pushed from below by a force that was testing it, probing it, seeing how much give there was. The board held its curve for 2 seconds, maybe 3, the wood creaking softly, the gap between the plank and the joist visible in the flickering stove light. Then it settled back, slowly, like a breath being exhaled. The board returned to its place, the nails seated themselves again, and the floor was flat and still. Nobody moved. Nobody acknowledged it. Raymond read louder. The woman across the aisle closed her eyes and her lips moved faster. Old Mr. Combs placed both hands flat on the pew in front of him and bowed his head. They all knew. Every one of them. They came to that church every February, knowing what was beneath them, knowing that some nights the floor would shift and the tapping would come and the boards would test themselves against whatever was pushing from below. They knew, and they came anyway, and they prayed louder, and they never spoke about it, as if speaking about it would give it something it didn't already have, as if silence was its own kind of seal. I stood up and walked out, didn't say a word to anyone, walked down the porch steps and stood in the frozen yard with the wind cutting through my coat, staring at the foundation of the building, at the gap where the clapboard siding met the ground, at the dark line of earth and concrete that separated the world I stood in from the world beneath the church. I never went to another February service. My mother asked me once why I'd stopped going. I told her the truth that I didn't feel right in that building. She took it as a teenage boy's excuse and let it go. Raymond never asked. I think he understood. I think he'd been waiting for me to hear it, and once I had, he knew I wouldn't come back. He didn't hold it against me. He just went on going himself, every Wednesday in February, reading scripture over whatever was moving beneath his feet, raising his voice one notch louder than the sound from below, holding the line the way his father had held it and his father before him. Raymond passed away 6 years ago. The church closed not long after the congregation had dwindled to almost nothing, and there was no one left to maintain it. Last I heard, the building is still standing. Locked up, paint peeling, the porch half collapsed, the stove cold. Nobody goes there anymore. But the foundation is still there. The concrete is still there. The root cellar is still there, sealed shut beneath the floor, 12 feet by 20, dark and airless and unchanged since 1930 something, when they poured the entrance shut and built a house of God on top of whatever they were trying to keep underground. I drive past the turnoff to Laurel Fork sometimes, on my way to other places. I never take it, but every February, usually around the 3rd week, I find myself thinking about that floor, about the quarter inch of flex in that pine plank, about the sound of knuckles on wood, rising from a place that has been sealed for nearly 100 years, about the man Raymond wouldn't name, the one who was locked down there during a dispute that nobody alive can remember the details of, the one who never came out. And I think about the thing that frightens me most, The thing that Raymond never addressed and the elders never spoke about, and nobody in that congregation ever had the courage to say out loud. The root cellar was sealed in the 1930s. If a man was locked down there, he died down there, decades ago, in the dark, in the cold, in a space too small to stand up in and too solid to break out of. Whatever is under that church floor should have stopped moving a long time ago. It hasn't. I've run the Ridgeline Outfitter shop for going on 8 years now. It's a small operation, just me most days. Occasionally my nephew Tyler during the summer months, when the foot traffic picks up enough to justify a second pair of hands. The shop sits at the base of a parking lot that services one of the lesser-known trailheads in the Great Smoky Mountains, the kind of access point that doesn't make it into the glossy brochures or the top 10 hiking lists. We get our share of through hikers, some weekend warriors, and the occasional lost tourist who thought they were heading to Clingman's Dome and ended up on a gravel road wondering where the gift shop went. It's a quiet business. I sell maps, trail snacks, basic gear, and a modest selection of local crafts that the women in the church group make on consignment. It pays the bills, barely, and it keeps me in the mountains, which is where I've wanted to be since I was old enough to know the difference between here and everywhere else. February is the dead month. I keep the shop open because the lease requires it, but there are days in February when I don't see a single customer. The parking lot sits empty from sunrise to dark. The trails are either iced over or buried under whatever the last storm left behind, and the only people who venture out are the hardcore types, the ones with crampons and trekking poles and emergency bivvies, packed like they're expecting to spend the night whether they plan to or not. I use the slow days to restock, do inventory, fix whatever broke during the busy season. Most afternoons, I'm alone with the radio and a cup of coffee, watching the fog drift through the parking lot like something that forgot where it was going. The trail that matters to this story is the Buckhorn Trace. It was a 6-mile out and back that climbed from the trailhead up to a rocky overlook with views of the valley and the Tennessee side of the range. Good trail, moderate difficulty, popular enough in the warm months. But 3 years ago, a section of the mountainside about 2 miles in gave way after a week of heavy rain. The landslide took out about a quarter-mile of trail, dropped it into the drainage below, and left a scar of exposed red clay and broken rock that the Forest Service deemed too unstable to repair or reroute. They closed the trail, put up barriers and signage at the trailhead, and that was that. Nobody hiked Buckhorn Trace anymore. The parking lot that used to fill up on autumn weekends now served the 2 remaining trails that branched off in the other direction. The trail camera was my addition. I'd put it up 2 years ago after a string of vehicle break-ins during the summer. It was a basic model, motion-activated, infrared for night shots, time-stamped to the second. I'd mounted it on a post at the edge of the parking lot, angled to cover the main area and the trailhead entrance. It had captured plenty of deer, a few bears, 1 very confused turkey, and 0 car burglars. I checked the SD card about once a week out of habit more than expectation. It was a Thursday in the 3rd week of February. The weather had been miserable all day, low clouds, spitting rain, temperatures hovering just above freezing. The kind of day that couldn't decide if it wanted to be winter or just a very mean version of spring. I'd had 0 customers. I was getting ready to close up around 4 o'clock, wiping down the counter and turning off the display lights, when the door opened. He came in without a greeting. No hello, no browsing glance around the shop, no acknowledgement that another person was in the room. He walked straight to the counter with a purpose that seemed rehearsed, like he'd practiced the route from the door to where I was standing. He was dressed for hiking, trail pants, a soft-shelled jacket, a day pack that looked well used, but everything about him was slightly off. His clothes were damp, not rain damp, but saturated, the way fabric gets when it's been wet for a long time and has partially dried and gotten wet again, over and over. His boots were caked in red clay, not the thin residue you pick up walking a muddy trail, but thick, heavy deposits packed into the treads and smeared up the ankles, the kind of accumulation that comes from walking through deep clay for miles. Red clay, the specific red clay of the Buckhorn Trace landslide zone. I recognized it because I'd walked up there myself a few times after the closure, and that clay stains everything it touches with a color that looks like dried blood. But it was his face that held me. His features were unremarkable, mid-40s, maybe, average build, brown hair that was damp and flattened against his forehead. What caught me were his eyes. They were open, focused, directed at me. But there was nothing behind them. No engagement, no recognition, no personality. They had the flat, vitreous quality of eyes in a photograph. He was looking at me the way a window looks at the street, facing the right direction but not actually seeing. "I need a map of the Buckhorn Trace," he said. His voice was even, level, each word delivered with the same inflection and the same weight, like a sentence being read by someone who understood English but had no relationship to the words. I told him the Buckhorn Trace had been closed for 3 years. Landslide, impassable. I pointed to the notice I kept pinned on the bulletin board behind the counter, the same Forest Service closure order I'd been displaying since they shut it down. He looked at the notice. He looked back at me. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate dip of the head, and then he turned and walked out the door. No argument, no follow-up questions, no disappointment. Just the nod and the exit, as smooth and purposeful as his entrance. I stood behind the counter and watched him through the front window. The parking lot was empty except for my truck, and I now noticed nothing else. No car, no vehicle of any kind. He'd arrived on foot, which was unusual but not unheard of. Sometimes hikers got dropped off, or they walked over from the campground a mile down the road. But the campground was closed for the season, and the nearest road with any traffic was 4 miles away. He walked across the parking lot toward the trailhead. His pace was steady, his arms at his sides, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He was heading directly for the Buckhorn Trace entrance, where the wooden barriers and the closure signs were clearly visible. I almost called out to him, but something made me hesitate. Something about the way he was moving. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. My brain kept rejecting it, offering alternative explanations, trying to reframe what my eyes were reporting into something that made sense. But there was no alternative. There was no reframe. The man was walking backward. His body was facing the trailhead. His feet were moving him toward it, but the motion was reversed. He was moving in a smooth, continuous backward walk, no stumbling, no turning of the head to check behind him, no adjustment of balance. His arms hung at his sides. His stride was even and unhurried. He moved across that parking lot the way a film moves when you hit rewind, the same action, the same physics, but running in the wrong direction. His boots left prints in the thin mud of the lot, and later, when I checked, those prints pointed toward the shop, away from the trail, as if he'd been walking from the trail to the shop and the prints were the only thing that made sense. I watched him reach the edge of the parking lot. I watched him pass the closure barriers without hesitating. I watched him step onto the Buckhorn Trace and disappear into the tree line, moving backward, never turning, never looking, as if the trail behind him or ahead of him. I no longer knew which word applied was a path he knew so well that he didn't need to see it. I went outside. By the time I got to the edge of the lot, he was gone. The trail bent sharply about 50 yards in, and beyond that, the trees closed ranks and the fog swallowed everything. I stood there in the rain and the cold, staring at the trailhead, and I felt something I've felt very few times in my life, a wrongness so fundamental that it didn't register as fear. It registered as confusion so deep it shut down my emotional response entirely. I wasn't scared. I was baffled. My mind had hit a wall it couldn't climb, and it just sat there at the base, staring up. I went back inside. I locked the door. I sat behind the counter for 20 minutes, doing nothing, thinking nothing, staring at the parking lot through the window. Then I went home. The next morning, I came in early and pulled the SD card from the trail camera. I took it inside, put it in my laptop, and started scrolling through the captures from the previous day. Most of it was nothing rain-triggered false alarms, a couple of timestamps where the wind had moved a branch into the sensor's field. Then I got to the 4 p.m. block. The first relevant capture was time-stamped 4:21 p.m. It showed a man emerging from the Buckhorn Trace trailhead, walking forward toward the shop. He was moving through the frame from left to right, from the trail to the parking lot. His clothes were damp. His boots were red with clay. His face was expressionless, his eyes flat. He was walking with that same even, purposeful stride, walking forward, coming out of the woods. The second capture was time-stamped 4:22 p.m. 1 minute later, it showed the same man, same clothes, same boots, same face. But this time, he was entering the trail, walking into the tree line, moving from the parking lot toward the Buckhorn Trace, going in. I sat there looking at the two images side by side on my screen. The timestamps were clear. 4:21 coming out, 4:22 going in. He had exited the trail 1 minute before he entered it. I went through the rest of the footage. There was no capture of him arriving at the parking lot before 4:21. No image of him walking across the lot from the road or from any other direction. The first time the camera saw him, he was already coming out of the trail. And there was no capture of him after 4:22. No image of him on the trail, no image of him in the lot, nothing. He went into the tree line at 4:22 p.m. and the camera never saw him again. But I had seen him. He'd come into my shop, he'd spoken to me, he'd asked for a map. That interaction happened between the two timestamps after he came out of the trail and before he went back in. The sequence, if you could call it that, was he came out of the woods at 4:21, walked to my shop, talked to me, walked back to the trail, and entered the woods at 4:22, except the walking backward part. Except the fact that when I watched him leave the shop, he was moving in reverse. Except the fact that everything about the encounter felt like a tape being played in a direction it wasn't recorded in. I drove to the ranger station that afternoon. I brought the SD card. The ranger on duty was a woman named Holt, whom I'd known casually for years, professional, competent, not the type to humor you without reason. I showed her the two images. I told her what I'd seen. I told her about the man, the backward walking, the red clay, the request for the closed trail map. I told her the timestamps didn't make sense. She looked at the images for a long time. She didn't say anything at first. She plugged the SD card into her own computer and went through the full day's footage frame by frame. She confirmed what I'd already found. No earlier captures of the man, no later captures, just the two images, 1 minute apart, in the wrong order. She copied the files to her system. Then she looked at me and said, very evenly, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't share this with anyone." She didn't explain why. She didn't offer a theory or a reassurance or an official line about camera malfunctions and timestamp errors. She just asked me not to share it, and something in the way she asked a heaviness, a weariness that went beyond this one incident told me she'd seen something like this before, or heard about it, or been told by someone else not to share something similar. I asked her if there had been any reports of hikers on the Buckhorn Trace since the closure. She hesitated. Then she said that a few times a year, they'd get reports from people in the area, trail runners, hunters, campers in the backcountry who claimed to have seen someone on or near the closed trail. The descriptions varied. Sometimes it was a hiker with a day pack. Sometimes it was just a figure in the tree line. The one consistent detail was the red clay on the boots and clothes, the same clay that covered the landslide zone 2 miles in. She told me they'd sent teams up the Buckhorn Trace multiple times in response to these reports. The trail was destroyed. The landslide zone was unstable. There was no way through it on foot without climbing equipment, and even then, the risk was extreme. They'd never found evidence of anyone on the trail. No footprints, no gear, no disturbance in the closure barriers, nothing. I asked about the backward walking. She looked at me and said she couldn't comment on that, which was its own kind of answer. I replaced the trail camera with a newer model, higher resolution, faster trigger speed, video capability instead of just stills. I check it every day now instead of every week. In the 3 months since the incident, it's captured nothing unusual. Deer, bears, rain, wind, the normal population of a parking lot at the edge of the mountains in winter. But I've started paying attention to things I used to ignore. The red clay, specifically. The Buckhorn Trace landslide is 2 miles up a closed trail. Nobody goes there. Nobody should be tracking that clay anywhere near my shop or the parking lot. But twice since February, I've found deposits of it. Once on the front step of the shop, a thin smear of that unmistakable red, as if someone with muddy boots had stood there and then walked away. Once on the driver's side door handle of my truck, a thumbprint-sized spot of red clay that I found when I went to open the door one morning before dawn. I cleaned them both off. I didn't tell anyone. I don't know what I'd say. The trail is still closed. The Forest Service has no plans to repair it. The landslide zone is too unstable. The cost too high, the demand too low. The Buckhorn Trace is, for all practical purposes, a trail that no longer exists. It goes 2 miles into the mountain and then it ends, swallowed by a wall of red clay and broken earth. And yet someone walks it, someone who comes out of the woods before he goes in, someone who moves through a parking lot in reverse, heading for a trail that leads nowhere, with clay on his boots from a place nobody goes. Someone who asked me for a map of a trail that's been dead for 3 years, with a voice that had no inflection and eyes that had no depth, as if the person in front of me was performing the idea of a person without quite understanding what a person is. I keep the shop open in February because the lease says I have to, but I close at 3 now, not 4. I lock the door and I check the parking lot, and I drive home before the light goes flat and the fog rolls in. Because the thing that stays with me, the thing I can't shake no matter how many rational explanations I line up and knock down, isn't the backward walking or the impossible timestamps or the red clay on my door handle. It's the nod. That slow, deliberate nod he gave me when I told him the trail was closed. Not surprise, not frustration, acknowledgement, like he already knew. Like the trail being closed didn't matter to him because the trail wasn't what he was using. Like the path he walked on wasn't the same path I could see, and the direction he moved in wasn't the direction my eyes reported, and the order in which things happened to him wasn't the order in which they happened to me. He nodded because I'd given him the answer he expected, and then he left, walking backward into a place that doesn't exist anymore, and the camera caught him coming out before it caught him going in, and none of it makes sense, and I've stopped trying to make it make sense. Some things in these mountains don't run in the same direction as the rest of the world. Some things have their own sequence, their own timeline, their own version of forward and back. And some trails, even when they're closed, even when they've collapsed, even when the maps say they end in a wall of red earth and broken stone, some trails are still being walked, just not by anyone who belongs here, and not in any direction we'd recognize. I've lived on Sutter Mill Road for 14 years. It's a dead-end gravel road about 6 miles outside of Floyd, Virginia, at the base of a mountain that doesn't have a name anyone agrees on. The locals call it Bald Ridge because of the treeless summit, but it's not on any map that way. The road runs about a mile from the paved county route to a turnaround at the end, where the gravel gives way to a logging track that hasn't been maintained since the 80s. There are 3 properties on the road. Mine is the first, about a quarter mile in. Harold Pruitt's was the second, another quarter mile past mine. The third belongs to a family named Overstreet, who use their place as a seasonal cabin and haven't been up since October. For most of the year, it was just me and Harold, and that suited us both fine. I moved out here after my wife passed, cancer. It was a long process and a short ending, and when it was over, I didn't want to be around people anymore. Not out of bitterness or despair, I just needed a different kind of quiet than what the world was offering. The house on Sutter Mill Road was cheap, solid, and far enough from everything that I could go 3 or 4 days without hearing another human voice. The mountain at my back, the woods on all sides, the road that went nowhere and connected to nothing. It was exactly what I needed. The silence out here isn't empty, it's textured. It has weight and rhythm. The creek in the ravine below the house, the wind in the canopy, the owls at night. You learn to hear it as a kind of language, and after a while, the language starts to feel like company. Harold was already there when I arrived. He'd been on that road longer than anyone, 30 years at least, probably more. He lived in a small frame house with a tin roof and a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. The property was neat, but not fussy. He kept the grass cut, the firewood stacked, the gutters clear. He had a vegetable garden in the summer that produced more than one man could eat, and he'd leave bags of tomatoes and squash on my mailbox post without a note, just the vegetables in a brown paper sack, and the understanding that I'd know who they came from. Harold was not a talker. In 14 years, I doubt we exchanged more than a few hundred sentences total. He'd wave when we passed on the road. He'd nod if we happened to be checking our mailboxes at the same time. Once or twice a year, he'd stop by with something practical, a tool he thought I might need, a heads up about a tree that looked ready to come down across the road. He never came inside my house, and I never went inside his. We had an understanding that was built on proximity and respect rather than friendship, and it worked. In a place this remote, that's often the best kind of neighbor you can have. Someone who's there, but doesn't need you to know it. Harold died on December 19th. Heart attack. His daughter, Marcy, found him 2 days later when he didn't answer the phone. She lived in Roanoke and made the drive up to check on him, found him on the kitchen floor. The paramedics said it was quick, which is the thing people always say whether it's true or not, because the alternative is too heavy to hand to a grieving daughter. I went to the funeral, small service at a church in Floyd, maybe 20 people, most of them Harold's age or older. Marcy spoke briefly. The pastor read from Ecclesiastes. They lowered the casket into a plot at the church cemetery, and I watched them shovel the red Virginia clay back into the hole until the box disappeared and the ground was level again. I shook Marcy's hand, told her I was sorry, and drove home. That night, the road felt different. Not quieter, the quiet was the same, but the quality of it had changed. It was the difference between being alone by choice and being alone because there's no one left. Harold's house was dark. His porch light, which had run on a timer and clicked on every evening at 5 for as long as I'd known him, stayed off. The house sat in the dark like a held breath, and the road felt longer than it had before. January passed. I didn't think about Harold more than normal. Grief has its own schedule, and mine had been calibrated years ago when Ellen died. I knew how to carry the weight of someone's absence without letting it pull me under. Harold was gone, the road was quiet, and life continued in its stripped-down way. February 3rd was a Monday. I'd been into town for groceries and was driving back up Sutter Mill Road around 5 in the evening. The sun was already behind the ridge, and the light had that thin, gray quality it gets in winter, when the day doesn't really end so much as slowly give up. The trees were bare, the ground was brown and frozen, and the air had a rawness to it that meant the temperature was dropping fast. I was passing Harold's property when I saw him. He was standing at the end of his driveway, next to his mailbox. The same spot where I'd seen him 100 times over the years, standing in that patient, unhurried way of his, like a man who had nowhere to be and was comfortable with that fact. He was wearing the flannel shirt, the heavy red and black plaid that he wore from October through March, the one that was so faded and softened by washing that it looked like it had been part of him rather than something he put on. His hands were at his sides. His posture was straight. He was facing down the road, toward my house, as if he'd been watching for my truck. I took my foot off the gas. The truck slowed to a crawl and then stopped, maybe 40 yards from where he stood. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and my heart doing something I couldn't name, not racing, not pounding, but vibrating at a frequency that was too fast and too subtle to be called a beat. I looked at him through the windshield. He didn't wave. Harold always waved. In 14 years, he had never once failed to raise his hand when he saw me on the road. It was reflexive, automatic, the gesture of a man who acknowledged your existence as a matter of principle. But he didn't wave. He stood there, still, his face turned toward me, but too far away to read in the failing light, and he didn't move at all. I stared for maybe 30 seconds. Then he turned, not quickly, not suddenly, but with a slow, stiff rotation of his whole body, as if his joints were reluctant, and walked around the side of his house, not toward the front door, not up the porch steps. He walked around the corner of the building and out of sight, moving with a gait that was close to Harold's but not quite right, a little too measured, a little too even, like someone walking to a rhythm that was slightly off from the one his body remembered. I sat in the truck for a long time after he disappeared. The engine idled, the heater blew, the last of the daylight bled out of the sky, and the road went dark. I told myself what any rational person would tell themselves. It was someone else, a relative, maybe. Marcy had mentioned siblings, or maybe cousins, people who might have come up to check on the property, who might have found one of Harold's old shirts in a closet and put it on against the cold. People who looked like Harold because they shared his blood. I drove home. I didn't sleep well, not because of fear, not yet, but because of the dissonance. The gap between what I'd seen and what I could accept. The shape of the man at the mailbox had been Harold's shape. The posture, the height, the slope of the shoulders, the way he held his head slightly forward, as if leaning into something only he could hear. 14 years of seeing a person every few days builds a template in your mind that's more accurate than a photograph. And the template matched. The next evening, I was on my porch around the same time, not waiting, not watching, just sitting with a cup of coffee as the light went down, the way I did most evenings. I looked up the road toward Harold's place, and there he was. Same spot, same shirt, same posture, standing by the mailbox facing my direction, but closer. Not at his mailbox this time, further down his driveway, maybe 20 yards closer to my property than he'd been the night before, as if he'd taken a few steps toward my house and stopped. I set my coffee down and stood. I walked to the edge of my porch and looked at him. The distance was maybe 150 yards, and the light was almost gone, but I could see him clearly enough to confirm what I already knew. It was Harold. Not someone who looked like Harold, not a relative or a cousin or a trick of the fading light. It was the man I'd watched for 14 years, the man I'd seen lowered into the ground 6 weeks ago, standing on his property in a dead man's shirt, looking at my house. He stood there for about a minute, then he turned, with that same stiff rotation, and walked behind his house again. Gone. I went inside and called Marcy. It was a difficult call to make. How do you tell a woman who buried her father that you've been seeing him standing in his yard at dusk? I kept it simple. I told her I'd noticed someone on the property, asked if she'd sent anyone up to check on things. She said no. She said the house was locked, the power was off, and no one had been there since she'd come up in early January to collect a few personal items. She said she'd meant to have the locks changed but hadn't gotten to it yet. She asked if I thought someone had broken in. I told her I didn't know, but I'd keep an eye on it. She thanked me and hung up. The next morning, I walked up the road to Harold's house. It was locked, as Marcy had said. The windows were dark. The porch was bare except for a folded lawn chair that Harold always left out. I walked the perimeter of the building, checking windows, checking the back door, looking for any sign that someone had been there. The ground was hard with frost, but in a few sheltered spots near the foundation, the earth was soft enough to hold an impression. I found boot prints, one set. They ran along the side of the house, from the front yard to the back, the same path the figure had taken when it walked out of sight. The prints were consistent in size and depth, a man's work boot, maybe size 10, the same size Harold wore. They went around the back of the house and then continued across the backyard toward the tree line. At the edge of the woods, they stopped, not gradually, not trailing off into leaves and undergrowth. They just stopped. The last print was crisp and full, both heel and toe clearly defined, and beyond it there was nothing, as if the person who made them had simply stepped out of existence at the tree line. I bought a trail camera that afternoon, a decent one, motion activated, with night vision and a timestamp accurate to the second. I mounted it on a fence post at the edge of my property, aimed up the road toward Harold's driveway, positioned to capture anything that moved between his house and mine. That evening, I watched from my porch. The light went down, the road went dark. I watched Harold's mailbox, his driveway, the corner of his house where the figure had disappeared twice before. I watched until full dark and then some, sitting in the cold with my coat zipped to my chin, straining my eyes against the black. I didn't see him, but in the morning, when I walked out to my truck, I found the boot prints. They were in the frost on my driveway, a single set, coming from the direction of Harold's house, walking in a straight line down the center of the gravel, each print pressed cleanly into the thin white layer of ice crystals that coated the stones. They came all the way down the driveway, past my truck, up to my front porch, and they stopped at my front door. Not on the porch, not on the steps, at the door. The last print was on the top step, maybe 6 inches from the threshold, angled slightly inward, as if the person who made it had been standing there facing the door, facing the place where I'd been sleeping on the other side of a 2-inch slab of wood. I checked the trail camera. I pulled the SD card and brought it inside, and went through every frame from the previous night, motion activated, infrared, clear field of view covering the entire road between my property and Harold's. It had captured nothing, not a single frame, no figure on the road, no movement of any kind, no trigger event between sundown and sunrise. Whatever had walked down my driveway and stood at my front door had done so without tripping a motion sensor that could detect a rabbit at 50 yards. The boot prints continued every morning for the rest of February. Every single day, I'd wake up, open my front door, and there they'd be a single set of tracks in the frost, coming from the direction of Harold's place, walking straight and steady and unhesitating down my driveway to my front door. Some mornings, the frost was light and the prints were faint. Some mornings, after a hard freeze, they were pressed deep and sharp, every tread mark visible, as if the person who made them had weight and substance and mass. They were always the same size, always the same boot, always stopping at the same spot. I never saw the figure at the mailbox again. Whatever I'd seen those 2 evenings in early February didn't repeat itself, at least not in a way my eyes could confirm. But every morning told me that something was still making the walk. Something was coming down that road in the dark, crossing the distance between Harold's property and mine, and stopping at my door, standing there. For how long? I don't know. Doing what? I can't say. I tried everything I could think of. I left the porch light on all night. The prince still came. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, watching the road from my kitchen window. I saw nothing, but the prints were there at dawn. I moved the trail camera 3 times, different positions, different angles, once aimed directly at my own front porch from 6 feet away. It captured nothing. The card would be empty every morning, and the prints would be there every morning, and the two facts existed side by side like parallel lines that refused to meet. On the last day of February, I did something I hadn't done in the weeks since this started. I opened my front door at night. It was around 2 in the morning. I'd been lying in bed listening to the silence, the deep, textured silence of Sutter Mill Road, the silence I'd come here for, and I felt something shift in it. Not a sound, a pressure, the feeling of someone standing on the other side of a door, the subtle displacement of air and attention that you can sense even through solid wood if you're tuned to it. I got up. I walked to the front door. I put my hand on the knob and stood there for a long time, feeling the cold metal under my palm, feeling the cold radiating through the door itself, and behind that cold, something else, a warmth, faint, localized, emanating from the other side of the door at about chest height, as if someone were standing there, close enough to touch, breathing warm air against the wood. I turned the knob and opened the door. The porch was empty. The road was dark. The mountain loomed against the sky, blacker than the black around it. The air was still and freezing and carried nothing, no sound, no movement, no presence I could identify. But on the top step, 6 inches from the threshold, there was a boot print in the frost. A single fresh print, the ice crystals around it still settling, the edges still sharp. It had been made moments ago. Seconds, maybe. Whatever had been standing there when I turned the knob, had been there when I felt the warmth through the door, and had gone in the time it took me to pull the door open. Gone without a sound, without a footstep, without disturbing the air. March came. The frost stopped, and with it, the prints. The mornings warmed enough that the driveway showed nothing, just gravel and mud, and the normal tracks of my own coming and going. I told myself it was over. Whatever February had brought, March had taken it away. The road was quiet. Harold's house sat dark and empty. The world returned to the version of itself that I could understand and inhabit, without feeling like the ground under my feet was thinner than I'd always assumed. But I know it's not over. I know it the way I know the mountain is there even when the clouds hide it, because the thing about February is that it comes back. It always comes back. And Harold's house is still up that road, dark and locked and holding whatever it holds, and the distance between his door and mine is still a quarter mile, and a quarter mile is nothing to a man who has nowhere else to go, and all night to walk it. I check the frost every morning now. Even in the months when there is no frost, I open my front door and I look down at the top step, and I wait for the day when I see the print again. The single, fresh, impossibly present print of a dead man's boot, 6 inches from where I sleep. And some nights, when the silence on Sutter Mill Road shifts in that particular way, when it goes from empty to occupied, from quiet to watched, I stand at my front door with my hand on the knob, and I feel the warmth on the other side, and I wonder what would happen if I opened it faster, if I caught him there, if I looked into the face of whatever is wearing Harold's shirt and standing in Harold's boots and making Harold's walk down a road that Harold will never walk again. I wonder if it would wave. People who didn't live through the ice storm of February 2023 don't understand what it was like. They hear ice storm and they think of slick roads and canceled school and maybe a day without power. They don't understand the scale of it. They don't understand what it means when the entire infrastructure of a rural county, every power line, every road, every connection to the outside world goes down at once and stays down for days. They don't understand what it's like to sit in a house that's getting colder by the hour, listening to trees explode in the dark, knowing that nobody is coming to help because nobody can get to you and you can't get to them. We live in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. My wife, Dana, and I bought our place about 7 years ago, a 2-story farmhouse on 12 acres, at the end of a road that branches off a county route. It's not remote by Appalachian standards, but it's remote enough. Our nearest neighbor is a half-mile away, and in winter, when the leaves are down and the mountain behind our property stands bare and gray against the sky, you can see just how much nothing surrounds us. It's beautiful in the way that lonely things are beautiful. Dana and I chose it for that reason. We wanted space and silence and the feeling of being held by the land rather than just sitting on top of it. We got what we wanted. What we didn't account for was what that space and silence become when the world around you shuts off and there's nothing left but the dark and the cold and whatever is in it. The storm started on a Thursday. The Weather Service had been warning about it for 3 days, a major ice event, they called it, which is the kind of language that sounds clinical until you're living inside it. The freezing rain began around noon and didn't stop. It fell with a steady, relentless patience, coating everything it touched in a layer of ice that thickened by the hour. By evening, the trees were glazed from root to crown, their branches bending under the weight, the whole forest making a sound like a chandelier being slowly crushed. The power went out at 8:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I was looking at the clock on the microwave when it went dark. We were as prepared as we could be. We had the wood stove, a decent supply of firewood, canned food, water, flashlights, batteries. We had candles. We had blankets. We had our 2 dogs, Bo and Clementine, a German Shepherd and a Hound mix, both big enough to generate their own heat and loyal enough to stay close when things got bad. We settled in for the night with the stove cranked high and told ourselves it would be a day, maybe 2. The power company would get to us. They always did. They didn't. Friday came and the rain continued. Saturday the same. The temperature dropped. The ice on the trees reached a thickness that I'd never seen before, half an inch, maybe more, encasing every branch, every twig, every surface in a shell of clear, hard ice that caught the gray daylight and threw it back in dull flashes. Trees started falling. Not 1 or 2 dozens. The sound was constant, a percussion of cracks and crashes rolling through the forest from every direction, near and far, all day and all night. Some of them fell across our driveway. Some fell across the road beyond. We were sealed in. By the 3rd day, Sunday, we were running low on firewood. I'd burned through the stacked supply on the porch and made 2 trips to the woodpile behind the house, which was treacherous. The ground was a sheet of ice. The air was still freezing, and every step was a negotiation with gravity. Dana suggested the furniture. We had an old bookcase in the spare room that was made of cheap pine and a set of wooden chairs we'd been meaning to replace. I broke them apart with a hatchet and fed them to the stove piece by piece. It felt wrong, burning our own belongings, but the house was dropping below 50 degrees in the rooms away from the stove, and the dogs were pressed against us with a desperation that went beyond affection. They were cold. We were all cold. Sunday night is when the tapping started. Dana and I were sitting on the couch in the living room, which we'd turned into our survival camp. The stove was there, the blankets were there, the dogs were there. The candles threw a soft, unsteady light that made the walls shift and breathe. The ice was still falling outside, ticking against the roof and the windows with a sound like tiny fingers drumming. But underneath that constant, ambient patter, there was something else. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps, a pause. I heard it first on the front window, the big double pane in the living room. It was louder than the ice, more deliberate, more rhythmic. Not the random scatter of freezing rain hitting glass. This was a pattern, a sequence. 3 evenly spaced taps, each one firm and distinct, followed by a pause of about 2 seconds, then 3 more. It sounded like knuckles on glass, like someone standing outside the window, raising their hand and knocking. I looked at Dana. She'd heard it too. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the window. The curtains were drawn. We'd closed them all to keep in whatever heat we could, so there was nothing to see except the fabric and, beyond it, the faint glow of ice catching the candlelight. Wind, I said. Ice on a branch. But the nearest tree to that window was 30 feet away. I knew because I'd cut back the old maple 2 summers ago specifically to keep branches away from the house. There was nothing close enough to reach the glass. Nothing that could tap with that kind of regularity and force. The tapping stopped at the front window. For maybe 10 seconds, the house was quiet, except for the stove and the ambient rain. Then it started again, this time at the kitchen window, on the opposite side of the house. Same pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. As if whatever was doing it had moved from one side of the house to the other in the time it takes to draw a breath. Dana stood up. I'm going to look. Don't, I said. I said it quickly, without thinking, with a certainty that came from somewhere below my rational mind. Not from logic, from instinct. The same instinct that makes you pull your hand back from a hot surface, that makes you freeze when you hear a rattlesnake before you consciously process the sound. Something in me knew that looking was wrong, that the tapping wanted us to look, that the pattern 3 and 3 and 3, circling the house, moving from window to window with a speed and purpose that no wind or animal could account for, was designed to draw attention, to pull a face to the glass. Dana sat back down. She didn't argue. I think she felt it too. The tapping continued. It moved to the bedroom window, then to the bathroom, then to the small window in the spare room where I'd broken up the bookcase. It was circling the house. Clockwise, I realized, moving around the perimeter in a steady, deliberate orbit, pausing at each window long enough to deliver its sequence before moving to the next. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. The circuit took about 2 minutes. When it completed, it started again, and again, and again. The dogs knew. Bo and Clementine had moved to the center of the room, as far from the walls as they could get. They were pressed together, Clementine's head tucked under Bo's chin, both of them trembling with a fine, continuous vibration that I could feel through the couch cushions. Their eyes were open and moving, tracking something, following a path around the room that matched the progression of the tapping, window by window. They could hear it, they could track it, and whatever information their senses were giving them, it was enough to override every instinct a dog has to investigate, to bark, to challenge. They were silent. They shook and they watched, and they didn't make a sound. That went on for hours. The tapping circled and circled, patient and mechanical, until the pattern became a kind of terrible metronome that I could feel in my teeth. Dana and I sat on the couch with the dogs between us, wrapped in blankets, not talking, barely moving. At some point, I don't know when, the hours blurred together, I realized that the freezing rain had stopped. The ice had stopped ticking on the roof. The only sound from outside was the tapping, 3 and 3 and 3, moving in its circle, and nothing else. The world beyond our walls had gone absolutely silent, as if everything out there, the wind, the rain, the forest, the night itself, had pulled back to make room for whatever was walking around our house. Eventually, I slept. I don't know how. Exhaustion, maybe. The body's refusal to sustain that level of adrenaline indefinitely. I woke up on the couch with Dana asleep against my shoulder, and the dog still between us, still trembling, and gray light coming through the curtains. Monday morning, the tapping had stopped. Monday was quiet. The rain had paused, though the sky stayed low and heavy, promising more. I went outside for firewood and checked the perimeter of the house. The ice was thick on everything, the porch, the steps, the railing, the ground. I looked at the windows, expecting to find marks or scratches or something that would explain the tapping. The ice on the glass was smooth and unbroken, no marks, no cracks. Whatever had been tapping hadn't left a trace. Monday night was the 4th night. We went through the same routine. Stove, candles, blankets, dogs. The house creaked around us as the temperature dropped again. I'd found a few more pieces of wood in the basement, old scraps from a project I'd abandoned, and fed them to the stove, one at a time, rationing what little fuel we had left. The cold was seeping in from every direction, from the floor and the walls and the windows, and the stove's circle of warmth had shrunk to a radius of maybe 4 feet. Beyond that, the house was a cave. The tapping didn't come back. I waited for it, my ears tuned to the frequency of 3 and 3. My body braced for the first knock on glass. But the windows stayed quiet. The house was still. Then I heard the breathing. It came from the back door, the door that opened onto the porch behind the kitchen, the one I'd been using to access the wood pile. It was a solid door, wood with a glass upper panel, and at the bottom there was a gap, maybe half an inch of space between the door and the threshold, where the weather stripping had worn away. I'd been meaning to replace it for 2 years. The gap was big enough to feel a draft through, big enough to hear through. The breathing came through that gap, deep, slow, wet. Each inhale was a long, shuddering draw, the sound of air being pulled through something moist and thick. Each exhale was a low, heavy push, warm enough that I could feel it, or imagined I could feel it, as a faint change in the air temperature near the floor. Whatever was breathing was pressed against the door. Close, intimate. Its mouth, if it had a mouth, and the sound certainly suggested something that did, was right against the gap, using it the way you'd use a straw, directing its breath into the house with a precision that felt intentional. Dana was awake. She was gripping my arm hard enough to leave marks I'd find the next morning. The dogs were rigid, their eyes locked on the back door, their bodies so tense that I could feel the vibration of their muscles through the cushions. Bo's lips were pulled back from his teeth, but he wasn't growling. He was silent. Whatever hierarchy of threat existed in his animal mind, whatever was behind that door occupied a level above anything he was willing to challenge. The breathing continued for maybe 20 minutes, slow, patient, unbroken. It didn't speed up or slow down. It didn't change in volume or intensity. It was the breathing of something that had arrived at a destination and was content to be there. I got my shotgun. It was a 12-gauge pump that I kept in the hall closet, loaded with buckshot. I'd grown up with guns, and I'd never once felt the urge to point one at something I couldn't see. But I picked it up and I walked to the back door, and I racked a shell into the chamber, and the sound of that action, the hard, metallic clack that every living thing on Earth recognizes as a threat, didn't change the breathing at all. It continued through the door, steady and wet and close. I unlocked the deadbolt. I turned the knob. I pulled the door open. The porch was empty. The backyard was empty. The tree line, 50 yards away, was a wall of ice-coated trunks standing motionless in the dark. The air was still and cold, so cold it burned my throat on the first breath. There was nothing behind the door, nothing standing on the porch, nothing crouching in the shadows, nothing retreating across the yard, just the ice and the dark and a silence so complete it felt like pressure. I looked down. The porch was covered in handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the thin layer of ice that coated the wood, each one a clear, detailed impression, palm, fingers, the texture of skin frozen into the frozen surface. They were everywhere. On the floor of the porch, on the railing, on the posts, on the siding next to the door. Some overlapped, some were isolated. They covered every surface within reach of something standing on the porch, as if whatever had been there had pressed its hands against everything it could touch, leaving its mark on every available surface. They were too large. That was the thing that made my vision narrow and my grip tighten on the shotgun until my knuckles ached. Each print was at least a foot across from the base of the palm to the tip of the longest finger. The fingers themselves were wrong, too long, too thin, with an extra joint or a curve that didn't match any hand I'd ever seen. They looked like the hands of something that was almost human, but had been stretched, elongated, reshaped by a process that had no interest in proportion. I stood on that porch for a long time, looking at the prints, feeling the cold crawl into me through my boots and my clothes and my skin. Then I went back inside and locked the door and sat down on the couch next to my wife and didn't say a word. The power came back on Tuesday afternoon. The ice began to melt on Wednesday. By Thursday, the handprints on the porch were gone, dissolved back into water, running off the wood in thin rivulets that carried no memory of what had made them. The roads cleared. The county crews came through with chainsaws and bucket trucks. The world reassembled itself around us, filling in the gaps that the storm had torn open, and within a week, everything looked the way it had before. Normal, functioning, explained. Dana and I didn't talk about it, not immediately. The days after the storm were consumed by practical concerns, restocking the firewood, replacing the furniture we'd burned, checking the property for damage. We moved through the recovery the way people move through the aftermath of any crisis. Focused, efficient, unwilling to look back until the forward motion stops. It was almost 2 weeks later when Dana told me. We were in bed, lights off, the house warm and humming with electricity, the dogs asleep at our feet. She said it quietly, the way you say things you've been holding in your chest and can't carry anymore. She said that on the third night, Sunday, the night the tapping circled the house, she had looked. When I'd told her not to, when I'd said it with that instinctive certainty that I couldn't explain, she'd nodded and sat back down. But later, when I'd fallen asleep on the couch, she'd gotten up. She'd gone to the kitchen window, the one the tapping had just passed, and she'd pulled back the curtain an inch and looked out. She said she saw a face pressed against the glass from the outside. Close, inches away, pressed flat against the window the way a child presses their face to a store window, forehead and nose and cheeks distorted by the pressure. The face was smiling. A wide, open smile that showed too many teeth, that stretched the lips beyond where lips should stretch, that turned the expression from something joyful into something anatomically wrong. The face was pressed so hard against the glass that the ice on the outside had cracked around the point of contact, spiderwebbing out from the nose and forehead in thin fracture lines. And the face, she said, looked like me. Not exactly like me, not a mirror image, but close enough that the resemblance was unmistakable and close enough that the differences were worse than if it had looked nothing like me at all. My features, my bone structure, My proportions but stretched slightly, adjusted slightly, as if something had studied my face and rebuilt it from memory, without quite understanding how the pieces fit together. The eyes were mine, but set too wide. The jaw was mine, but too long. The smile was something I'd never made and never would. She said it looked at her through the glass for 3 or 4 seconds. Then it pulled back from the window and was gone. She heard the tapping resume at the next window, continuing its circuit, and she went back to the couch and sat down next to me and didn't say anything until 2 weeks later in our bed in the dark. I didn't know what to say. I still don't. I held her, and we lay there, and the house was quiet and warm, and the dogs slept, and the world outside was normal. And I thought about a face that looked like mine pressed against our window in an ice storm, smiling a smile I'd never smiled, circling our house with a patience that suggested it had done this before and would do it again. February is coming back. The long-range forecasts are already talking about a cold stretch at the end of the month, possible ice. Dana hasn't mentioned it, I haven't mentioned it, but I've noticed things. I've noticed that she's started pulling the curtains earlier in the evening. I've noticed that she's bought heavier curtains for the kitchen, the kind you can't see through even when you hold a light behind them. I've noticed that she doesn't go near the back door after dark anymore, and that when the wind picks up and something rattles against the glass, she flinches in a way she never did before. And I've noticed one more thing. The wood stove doesn't hold heat the way it used to. Or maybe the house doesn't hold heat the way it used to. Because on cold nights, even with the stove burning strong and the house sealed tight, there's a draft. A faint, persistent cold that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the walls themselves are breathing in the winter air through gaps too small to see. And sometimes, when I put my hand against the back door, against the gap at the bottom where the weather stripping is still worn, I feel something coming through from the other side. Not wind, not cold. Warmth. A faint, rhythmic warmth that pulses against my fingers like breath. I still haven't replaced that weather stripping. I don't know why. Maybe because replacing it would mean admitting that something was breathing through it. Maybe because part of me is afraid that sealing the gap won't stop the breathing. It'll just make it find another way in. Or maybe because, in the quietest, darkest part of my mind, in the place where the thoughts live that I'll never say out loud, I want to know what's on the other side. I want to understand what wears my face and circles my house and presses its 2 large hands into the ice on my porch. I want to know what it's smiling about. I just don't want to open the door to find out.